Ga Golden Cage is a mobile game about imprisonment in which the main character, a beastman, finds herself sold as a pet to a prince who eventually becomes obsessed with her. Among the bare trees, whose branches are decorated with snow-white snow, stands a huge stone castle. A girl appeared at the top of the tower, Eugene, who had been reincarnated as the beastman. She decided that as in the original, she would try to escape again. While trying to tie the rope to the fence, the lady became angry because she couldn't do it. But suddenly, the lady froze and sneezed because she was being blown by a terribly frosty air, and she herself was dressed in only a dress. Looking at her trembling palms, the blonde thought that it was very cold outside, and for some reason her owner was in no hurry to get her. Suddenly, a male voice called out to her from behind the girl. It was the prince, a man with silver hair and yellow eyes. The heroine looked at him and was surprised in her mind that he had come after all. And if she had been a real beast girl, she would have jumped down long ago. Extending his hands to the lady, His Highness asked her to come down quickly as it was dangerous to be here. She sneezed again and wondered why the young man wasn't saying what she was expecting. The prince began to apologize to the lady, but the heroine was confused and upset because, again, this was not what she wanted to hear from him. The man extended his palms closer to Eugene, but she closed her eyes, wanting to quickly move on to that very dialogue, waiting for the answer options to appear. The prince carefully lowered the girl to the floor, but she did not react to anything but only waited for those very words from the master. The protagonist recalls that in the original, it was at this moment that the man developed a distrust of her and an unnatural obsession. Now he should ask her coldly why she ran away. But to the protagonist's surprise, the prince merely thoughtfully draped a fur coat over her shoulders, asking her not to freeze in the cold. The lady recalls that this never happened in the game. Belobreska became embarrassed because she realized that she was much warmer, but suddenly she ordered herself to pull herself together because she needed to choose an answer to his question. Here, the lady with a robotic intonation confidently told the prince that she would leave this place. An awkward silence arose between the man and the girl became embarrassed because, in fact, her words were a brazen bluff, just a game. His Highness told his pet he couldn't let her go. The heroine decided to test something. Would an in-game event begin if she made the right choice? Eugene, still frowning and blushing, told the man that he didn't even dare think about locking her up. Suddenly, the girl hears something that stuns her. The prince apologized for upsetting her, then asked where she would go in such cold without preparation. The gentleman patted the lady on the head and promised to take her for a walk tomorrow. The girl thought that such a phrase wasn't in the plot and that she really wouldn't go anywhere. But suddenly, the blonde, angrily pulling the man's hand away from herself, declared that she would definitely fly away from this golden cage. Then she made a sullen face and fell silent, expecting that His Highness would finally come to terms with her desire to escape and would maliciously allow her to do so, but she would be captured and the escape would be a failure. But the prince said with a smile that he was sorry that she didn't like the cage he bought last time and would immediately remove it from the apartment. Milady stared at the man in surprise, wondering where everything had gone wrong, while the gentleman asked if it would be better for her to buy an aquarium. Suddenly the young lady sneezes again, which frightens the gentleman so much that he shudders. Taking the girl in his arms, the young man said that they were urgently returning to the palace, to which she resigned herself because she thought it was too cold outside. After some time, the prince and his pet came to their private room, where they lit a fireplace to warm themselves. Settling down by the fire with a blanket and tea, the blonde tells her master that he couldn't break her. She will always strive for freedom. He agreed. The girl noticed the gentleman was smirking, so she asked him what was making him laugh. The man asked her what she didn't like. After that, the heroine fell silent. Eugene recalls that in the original she was a pet who tried to escape, and the prince, angered by this, was supposed to become obsessed with her. However, She does not understand why he is now giving her such a warm look and gently stroking her cheek, asking if she is comfortable. Looking into the man's eyes, the lady thought it didn't matter. They didn't hate each other as in the game itself, so she thought everything would be fine even though the gentleman had initially been attached to his things. Suddenly the girl asked the man in a rude, furious tone if he was laughing at her. He flinched at the unexpectedness and asked her again. Yujin repeated that she would run away from him anyway, but His Highness calmly said that he would never allow that. Even more enraged by these words, the lady buried her face in the blanket and asked what he was talking about, then ordered the man to leave. The worried prince asked his pet to come out quickly, but she refused, and reasoned that her owner apparently enjoyed watching her attempts to escape. The maid, leaving the master's room and closing the door behind her, sighed tiredly and said that the same thing was starting again. While taking away the used tea utensils, she complains to her friend that Yujin is starting his catch me love test again. The girl asked her friend if she thought the gentleman was enjoying it, to which she replied that if they both liked it, then so be it. Meanwhile, the main character and the prince lay down on the floor among a mountain of huge soft pillows to take a nap together. But then the girl felt uncomfortable and irritably asked His Highness to stand up because he was too heavy. The lady was so angry that she pushed the gentleman away from her on her own, but the owner, suddenly lovingly lowering his eyelashes, passionately grabbed the girl's hand by the wrist, enjoying their touch. She instantly became embarrassed and pulled her hand away, wondering if he would leave her alone even if she bit off his hand. Suddenly the protagonist noticed that the smile had vanished from the prince's face. She was perplexed as to why the gentleman had become so dejected. The lady recalls that in the original he was completely different, cold-blooded, unperturbed, and incredibly strong. Finally, the blonde told her owner that she was very hot and asked him to stay away from her, but the prince, declaring that this was most likely not the case, pushed the girl, and she lay down on the pillows, and he, leaning on his arm, hung over her and began to glare at her. The gentleman continued to stroke his pet's cheek, and the heroine, with wide eyes and an embarrassed smile, asked what he was saying and whether he had taught her. However, the gentleman, coming even closer to the girl's face, asked her again, and Yujin, blushing excitedly, thought how he could be so handsome. The lady, feeling extremely embarrassed, called out loudly to Michael and covered his face with her hands, asking him to stop looking at her so intently. Suddenly, the prince, pressing himself against the girl's palm and rubbing against it, said that he would fulfill her request, calling the heroine the most beautiful lady. This left the blonde speechless. She couldn't understand what kind of person this was in front of her, and where that cruel tyrant from the original version had gone. Time flashes back to the past, where Yujin, who works in a large, tall office building, is being yelled at by her boss. The director, throwing stacks of papers at the girl, angrily asked how she was going to continue working like this if she was creating such insignificant reports. The angry man hurried away from the worker, who, with her head down, remained standing and silent. Yujin began to clean up the papers scattered on the floor, but two other workers approached her and asked how she planned to continue working. However, the men's next words made the heroine freeze, frowning. They said that she could get out if she made the same mistake again. The girl's colleague came to see her, was initially surprised by the tense atmosphere around her, and then asked the employee if everything was okay. He, secluded in the protagonist's office, asked her with a smirk what she could have done to anger her boss so much. The man said he'd called her to discuss the company's work. Yujin began to prove that she had done everything he advised her to do, but asked if he wanted her to act as if it was only his doing. The girl added that she waited until the last minute for him to tell her everything, but he remained silent. Her colleague smirked and said she'd be leaving soon. The worker waved his hand and asked the lady why she was so surprised, then reminded her that he had said that women do not stay long in this company. The news the heroine heard from her colleague made her mouth drop. He had heard from the HR department that she would soon be leaving their office. Yujin froze in shock as the man continued to say that she, unlike everyone else, was working under an employment contract and he didn't want any trouble because of her. The girl left the office without saying a word, not understanding why she had been holding on all this time. Contract workers, a boss with anger issues, incompetent managers. The heroine devoted too much time and energy to all of them. Tears rolled down Eugene's cheek as she wanted to show her deceased parents that she had become a worthy office worker by getting an official job. The protagonist wiped away her tears, but realized that she felt like a fool because she had no idea that the company was sucking everything out of her and then simply firing her. But suddenly a strange sound made the girl dispel her thoughts. She heard a sweet ringing sound. Looking up, the worker saw a billboard advertising a dog treat, recommended by Eugenie, the world's #1 dog. Eugene rubbed her eyes and thought that dogs were the ones with the best destiny. They would inherit everything she envied them because she couldn't even afford an office. But the heroine, walking on as if nothing had happened, decided that this was not so, because before thinking about personal housing, she first needed to find a job. The protagonist hopes that in her next life she will become a rich man's dog, because then she will not have to do anything and not think about difficult things. Suddenly, the sound of a phone ringing in Eugene's purse indicated a new message. At the same time, the dismissed employee came to the pedestrian crossing to cross the road where the green light had already come on for people, while other pedestrians were quickly walking along the zebra. Crossing, the heroine, lagging behind everyone else, looked at her phone and saw that she had received a notification from the game Golden Cage. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a truck appeared, driving down the road and showing no sign of slowing down. Stunned passers-by shouted to Eugene that a car was heading towards her at full speed, but she unfortunately noticed it too late. Just one moment and the asphalt is stained with scarlet spots, and the girl's phone falls nearby. The protagonist realized that this was her end, while the download for the special event, Golden Cage, was already finishing on her smartphone. Suddenly, the main character opens her eyes, which surprisingly are not like her previous ones. Moving her hand a little, she realized that she was not on the asphalt, but on some cold, dirty floor. A sharp, disgusting smell hit the girl's nose, and looking around, she realized that she was in some kind of cage, with some kind of half children, half animals. Then a girl with brown hair and ears appears next to her, asking her if she is okay and if she wants a drink since she cried all night. The protagonist was alarmed by this child, but when she wanted to answer something, she could not because she was so dehydrated that she could not speak. Noticing this, the girl with brown ears handed the heroine a container of water and asked her to drink. However, Eugene, taking the dishes in her hands and seeing her reflection in the water, was slightly surprised because instead of herself, she saw some toddler with white hair. Deciding not to dwell on this for long, the girl drank some water, emptying the container completely. The girl with brown ears cheerfully asked the child if she was feeling better. The child sighed at first, then thought she knew who this kind child was. Green eyes, brown hair, and triangle-shaped ears indicate that this is the main character of the mobile game Golden Cage, Canis. The main character looked around, wondering if Prince Michael had appeared yet. She recalls that this man was so obsessed with Canis that he even imprisoned her. He's also the most popular character in the game. Here, Canis asked her new friend to calm down, although her shock was not surprising, since she, like everyone else here, had been sitting here since yesterday. Eugene remembered that if there is a white-haired child next to the heroine, then this is the character whose hair turned white because he was abandoned by his parents. This is also the character Michael kills at the very beginning to punish Canis. The protagonist thought the prince didn't usually act like a madman. Canis cheerfully asked the girl her name, then introduced herself. At that moment, the blonde realized she was truly in the game. Before giving her name, the main character thought for a moment as she had a strange nickname in the Golden Cage, but in the end she decided to use her real name, thinking that it would not be difficult to pronounce, so there would be no problems. Candace smiled and told her friend that she had a beautiful name, then asked if she had calmed down. She replied that she had and then thanked her for the water. The new girl caught the attention of other beastmen, and the mobile game's main character asked Eugene if she would mind telling her how she got here since everyone here shares their stories. The protagonist asked warily why she was sharing her story with them. Candace replied that if you knew how you got here, you could find a way out. Namely, you needed to describe what she saw outside the cage. At that moment, Eugene remembered that she was in the slave shop from the first episode, where the main character was looking for a way to escape. But then she realized that she knew absolutely nothing, which is what she wanted to tell her new friend. But suddenly the girls were distracted by the voice of a man who, lifting a dirty red rag from the floor, asked what it was. This man turned out to be Michael himself, dressed in an expensive suit, a cloak, and armed with an expensive saber. The blonde's eyes sparkled because she realized that since she was in a slave shop, this man was the first necessary event. While admiring the prince, the girl also understood why everyone liked 2D so much. The illustration in the game was the best she had ever seen. Meanwhile, Mr. Michael, lowering his stern gaze to Eugene, asked what this strange thing was. The young gentleman and the white-haired girl looked at each other for a long time, when suddenly someone's hand appeared in front of the latter's face, as if it wanted to protect her. It turned out to be Candace, who, looking at Michael, hissed angrily like a cat. The man, looking calmly at her, said that this store was full of strange goods. Then he asked the merchant what the things in the cage were. The smiling shopkeeper replied that this was a very popular item, young masterless beastmen. He added that wolf-kindled beastmen were loyal and intelligent if trained. The moment the prince asked how much it cost, Candace growled and barked even louder. The irritated merchant asked the girl if she had gone crazy, and the heroine meanwhile remembered that now was the time for the first choice. Michael, frowning angrily with his white eyebrows and smiling, asked the little animal, how dare she bare her teeth and bark at him? Eugene remembered that the player's choice would determine the game's ending. Either Candace would continue barking at the man or he would keep his mouth shut. However, no matter what she chose, she felt that the game had a bad ending, where the protagonist would die while remaining in the cage or while being punished for causing trouble. People who played The Golden Cage enjoyed collecting different endings, but the heroine was always unhappy because she wanted only one thing, freedom. Looking at Candace, the protagonist, thought that she was very unhappy because such a life full of treasures means nothing if you can't change it. But suddenly, Eugene came to her senses because she caught herself thinking that in the moon palace full of treasures, nothing could be done or changed. Then she remembered that, in her past life, she had dreamed of becoming a rich man's dog. The realization of her chance left her with a gasp of surprise. Meanwhile, Mr. Michael calmly asked the merchant about the little animal girl with brown hair. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, Eugene began barking like a dog, loudly and persistently. The other beastmen who were in the cage with the blonde stared at her in shock. Looking at the girl who barked the loudest, the prince asked the shop owner if she was a beast person, to which he sheepishly replied that she was not. Eugene, thinking that it was crazy that such an opportunity was only available to the main character, continued to hap, causing confusion in her new friend. The protagonist believes she's already died once, but she doesn't want to die again. She stops making noise and waits for Michael to respond. The man mockingly told the girl that she wasn't even a beast man, but she still barked. Then he declared that this was more interesting and asked the merchant for the price. The heroine, delighted that the prince had finally said that very line from the first choice, stood up, deciding that now she too should make a choice. She firmly told the gentleman that he should not think that he could buy a person with money. After her brilliant phrase, Eugene stood there pleased with herself, while the prince, the merchant, Candace, and the other beast children stared at her in shock. The merchant's nerves were already failing him, and Michael, covering his smile with his hand, told the girl that she considered herself a human being, although she had just been barking. She thought that even people could bark sometimes, then remembered that Candace had said this when she was angry, that the prince treated them like things. Michael chuckled and said that it would be nice to raise a wild girl who knew nothing, and then told the merchant that he was buying her. Eugene was so happy that her plan had succeeded that she glowed like a flower. While the girl was being led out of the cage, she thought that she also had options available, even though she was not the main character, and she remembered all the events necessary for the finale, so everything would go smoothly. Candace, who remained in the cage, called out to her friend in alarm, but she smiled ominously and decided that unlike everyone else, she did not need freedom. Looking out the window of a moving carriage, she recalls that even in Korea she was a servant to her boss. Now she cares nothing more than a comfortable night's sleep and delicious food. Admiring the luxurious castle visible on the top of the mountain, the heroine realized that since she was going to be a nobi, it would be better to be in a great house. Soon the prince arrived on horseback at the palace gates, where he was met by 2 guards. Then the guards, while the main character had already jumped out of the carriage, approached the coachman and said that they would carry the things themselves from now on. Eugene wasted no time in rushing after the master, but then another guard noticed her. The man blocking the girl's path with a spear ordered her to stand and declared that she was not allowed to enter further. However, the girl did not lose her composure and called out to Michael at the top of her voice, who, hearing this, flinched and stopped. The little slave continued to call out for her master, while the guard stubbornly shut her mouth and asked her not to make so much noise. The prince, glancing at the girl out of the corner of his eye, ordered the guards not to hold her back and to let her through. The embarrassed guard immediately released the little girl, who had already choked to death in his hands. Having regained her freedom, the protagonist ran after the young gentleman, her bare heels flashing. As soon as the prince reached his palace, he was immediately met at the entrance by a maid and a butler, who were very surprised by the new man. The main character hid behind his highness, eyeing the servants with interest. The man asked Michael who the girl was, but he didn't answer him and only asked him to wash the child from the dirt, after which he went on about his business. The maid, looking at Eugene's unkempt hair and her dirty clothes, said that she agreed with the prince, and the first thing to do was start with the bathroom. The maids wasted no time preparing a bubble bath for the little girl. They also helped her with the bath. After this, the servants dressed the slave in a plain but clean and new outfit. The maid tells the little girl that when she asked the prince about her, he only told her to stay in the palace, but didn't tell her why. So the woman asks Eugene to tell her why she's here. At this point, the main character remembers that in the original story, Candace was also a maid, although no one asked her to be one. But the protagonist herself, with a smug smile, answered the woman that she was now the owner's dog. Hearing this, the maid and the 2 servants opened their mouths in surprise and stared at the slave, unable to utter a couple of words. Eugene smiles as she recalls the prince saying she'll grow up to be a wild dog. The girl is amused by the fact that the servants have never seen anyone like her. Then the maid thought deeply about something, and the maids looked at each other in bewilderment. Eugene, deciding that since she was her master's dog, she had to be by his side, came to Michael's luxurious chambers. The girl kept walking around the room and admiring the high painted ceilings, expensive paintings, furniture, and crystal chandelier. Walking up to the huge, soft bed, she kicked off her shoes and plopped down on it, surprised at how comfortable it was. Suddenly, the blonde girl thought about the fact that the earth on which nothing could be achieved was worth destroying, but here she would not have to worry about anything. The little girl believes that the maid, knowing the prince's character, did her a favor by leaving her here. The heroine doesn't care whether the prince kills her or she dies herself. Eugene began running around the bed like a puppy, thinking she didn't care about the future anymore because she didn't want to think or do anything. Her motto: live like a dog. A dog's life is a dog's life. Suddenly, a tall, stately figure appeared in the room. Michael calmly asked the slave what she was doing there. The girl stopped dancing and looked at the man with burning eyes, calling him her master. His Highness, with the same frightening calm, asked the child why she called him that. She asked the gentleman with a cheerful grin if he considered her his little dog. The young heir, his servant and maid who had entered the room after him, fell into awkward silence. The main character was confused by this reaction, but she still began to bark, imitating a real dog. The prince continued to look at her silently, and the girl, without stopping barking, wondered what the hell was going on. Eugene told His Highness that he had promised that he would train her, and so she must always be by his side. Michael replied in a cold tone that he did not allow the dog to lie in his bed. The protagonist thought that, indeed, the gentleman wasn't the type to let a dog on his bed. Meanwhile, the prince ordered his servant to bring him a doghouse. The butler's head immediately spun with excitement. Apparently, the order meant that they were obliged to place the child in a kennel and send him to live in the garden. Noticing his subordinate's hesitation, Michael sighed and asked to give the girl a separate room, which made him sigh with relief. The servant gave the protagonist her own room. It did not look as expensive as the previous one, but it also had all the amenities. The child looked around the bedroom with admiration, and the butler reminded her that if she needed anything, she would just have to pull the rope. Immediately after this, the man wished the slave good night, and all the candles in the room went out, leaving it now illuminated only by the moonlight. As she covered herself with a blanket, Eugene remembered that the prince had been indifferent to Canis at the beginning of the game, but he turned out to be kinder than she had expected. Meanwhile, a certain memory came to Michael, thanks to which he realized that the troubles began with the words of that girl. It's a memory of him and his father and his mistress drinking tea in the garden, when the lady confessed that she felt sorry for the beastmen living in cages. It was Annette, a woman with black hair and eyes whose identity and origin are unknown. She was the woman who held Emperor Dietrich's heart in her hands. The ruler was madly in love with Annette, whose appearance was otherworldly. However, when she appeared, Dietrich already had a wife, a beautiful lady with snow-white hair. But for a man who had lost his head from love, neither the marriage vows nor the newborn twins, a prince and a princess, mattered. After the empress's death in a carriage accident, the scandalous assumption that the emperor had murdered her was well-founded. One day, when the servants brought Dietrich his grown son, he ordered them to do everything to ensure that his offspring would quickly live up to his expectations. After this, the teachers piled a pile of textbooks on the boy's desk, declaring that today he should study imperialism, ancient languages, and military science. After some time, the subordinate delighted the emperor by saying that his son was simply a genius in terms of studies, to which the emperor said that he would continue to give the child a full imperial education. The servant said that the boy already had a lot of schoolwork, but the father angrily asked if he had lied when he called Michael a genius, and the servant fell silent. Immediately after this, the teachers began to burden the child, who was already up to his ears in lessons, with classes in geometry, geography, law, and so on. The teacher, looking at his student, thought that he had previously been worried that it would be difficult for him, but apparently he was coping. But no one had any idea what exactly the prince was losing under such an extremely high load. The teacher, conducting a practice with Michael, excitedly asked him why he chose the tactic of destroying an entire village if there was only one spy. The boy calmly replied that he did so because it was the most effective in information warfare. The teacher reminded the student that he was putting innocent lives on the line, but the prince calmly asked what was wrong with that. The child's cold-blooded response was both surprising and frightening. But by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. Several years later, the emperor tells his grown-up son that the time has come to involve him in government work. He took the scroll in his hands and said that it was an agenda from the provincial estates, after which he ordered that what had happened be sorted out and everything be resolved. Throwing the documents at Michael, who was kneeling, Dietrich said that he considered himself well suited for the job, and that the tax issue raised at the noble assembly had also been discussed by him. Michael himself simply listened to his father's orders without raising his eyes or saying a word. Now, drinking tea with her lover and his son Annette tells the latter that she heard that he has been helping Dietrich a lot lately. The prince modestly said that there was nothing special about it, after which the girl was surprised at how modest he was, and in this he was not at all like his father. The king intervened in their conversation, asking his mistress not to look at other men but him. She replied that this man was after all his son. But suddenly the young gentleman's hand froze when Annette said that she felt sorry for the beastmen she saw in the play and who lived in cages. The emperor, smiling, asked his beloved if she wanted him to free them. She asked if he would truly do so, to which he replied that he would. Dietrich then turned his stern gaze to his son and asked if he had heard, after which he ordered him to investigate the situation with the beastmen and make a plan. Michael silently placed his cup on the table. He thought his father had simply invited him for tea, but he also needed someone who would indulge his mistress's whims. However, the prince did not even imagine what kind of meeting these troubles would bring him. Meanwhile, the heroine recalls that even before their eyes met, the prince behaved recklessly, but he doesn't even know who she is. The girl is certain he wanted a loyal dog. It was morning, but the sun had not yet risen. However, even then the young gentleman was already busy with affairs of state. Looking at the view from the window and remembering that I had not seen the slave yet today, I thought that she was probably still sleeping. Later, the prince's personal butler informed him that his breakfast of hot steak and soup was served, and Michael began his first meal of the day. While eating, His Highness decided to ask the servant what was going on with his instructions, but he suddenly asked what instructions he was talking about. The man became worried because he did not remember any of the prince's instructions, but the next moment he realized that he was talking about the newly arrived slave. Michael, not hearing an immediate answer, slammed his cutlery on the table and said that if someone does not understand their responsibilities, then this is very bad. The subordinate obediently replied that they had given the girl his old playroom as a booth, assigned her a maid, and prepared personal shackles for her. The young master, picking up the iron collar, asked what it was for. The butler explained that they could be detonated if a slave tried to escape. But before the servant could finish speaking, Michael lightly squeezed the shackles in his hand, which instantly split into several pieces. Having thrown away the remains of the metal, the man, as if nothing had happened, told the servant that the collar was too fragile and that another copy should be prepared. After some time, Eugene was presented with her new, incredibly beautiful shackles. But the girl, looking at the product with bewilderment, asked what it was. Michael, watching the little girl examine the collar, thought that last time she got away with staying in his chambers because he was generous, thinking that it was dangerous to wander around here, so she would not leave the palace. He explained to the girl that these were her shackles, after which he wanted to explain something to her, but did not have time as something distracted him. The man fell silent when he saw Eugene smiling. Childishly put the shackles on herself. The young master was a little confused, but he asked the slave if she knew what it was. The main character, mentally surprised by the shackles Countess had prepared for her, happily asked the prince if this thing was for her. Michael's eyes widened slightly in shock. He couldn't believe she actually liked that collar so much. At this time, the protagonist, still rejoicing over such a gift, thinks that Countess may not have liked it, but for her it is a guarantee of safety. However, Michael is in no hurry to rejoice about anything. He was wondering what the blonde believed in if she put this on without hesitation. The man recalls that all the noblemen he knows around him always tell him with a smile that he is a very fair man. However, he knows what they say behind his back. They call him an insensitive, chilling, cruel tyrant. His Highness doesn't deny it, but he sincerely doesn't understand why Eugene trusts him so much and whether she doesn't have a simple instinct for self-preservation. Having decided that his dog was too naive and stupid, the prince thought that it would be better for her never to leave the palace. The butler, standing to the side, wondered at what point the successor's self-defense systems, which created a protective shell, recognized location and protected against the cold, began to be called shackles. A sunny morning arrived, and two maids obediently served the girl a delicious breakfast in bed. One servant offered the little girl a piece of cake, while another, smiling, asked if she should bring the cookies she had liked the day before. But the heroine thought about the fact that Canis and Prince Michael in the game were about the same age. But since the latter is now 16, then she herself is younger. She wondered if it was possible that she simply didn't look her age, because she was malnourished, as she had rather small arms and legs. The maid continued to offer the young lady various sweets to try, and this time she offered her pudding. She handed the girl a spoon with a piece of it. She opened her mouth with pleasure, thinking that thanks to this everyone thought she was a child and treated her kinder, so everything was fine. After a delicious breakfast, Eugene yawned. She was sleepy again after eating, even though she had slept so much recently. The girl decides it doesn't matter, and will go back to sleep since she doesn't have to go to work anyway. The heroine believes a dog's life is a fairy tale, but a week later her gaze was unrecognizable. There was no longer joy in it, because the dog realized that for a whole week she had only eaten and slept. Wrapped in a blanket and not leaving her favorite bed, the protagonist thought that no one was telling her anything, but she felt that it was time to change something. Suddenly, the girl's attention was drawn to the warm sunlight streaming through the window. It made her realize what she wanted right now. Having changed into an elegant, light green dress, Eugene came into the garden and, looking at the sky, thought about the last time she went outside. But then her gaze fell on a gazebo, a Western-style pavilion, the beauty of which greatly impressed the little lady. Arriving at the gazebo, she kicked off her shoes and climbed onto a bench. She was very tired from not moving for so long. The girl decided to rest there. At this time, Michael is at a meeting where some nobles, tearing their throats, believe that the project should be on their territory, but others deny this because their time has come to help the prince. The young gentleman himself only frowned and silently listened to the quarrel between the duke and the nobleman, who could not agree on anything. But at one point His Highness's nerves could not stand it, and he abruptly rose from his chair without uttering a word. The man started to walk away, but the servants tried to stop him, saying that after spending so much time at the meeting, he couldn't just up and leave. Michael, continuing to walk, is angry that a bunch of aristocrats are already jumping to a new problem when he hasn't even dealt with the beastmen. Suddenly, the gentleman stopped, deciding that sooner or later he would find someone to take their place. The young man then continued running, turning sharply to the right, stunning the guards who were trying to catch up with him and bring him to his senses. Eventually, the prince's feet led him into the garden, where he immediately headed to the gazebo. But suddenly, something unusual made him stop. The two guards behind him did the same. Michael saw his dog on the gazebo bench, sleeping soundly curled up in a ball. His subordinates immediately became nervous, as this place was reserved exclusively for His Highness, and outsiders were forbidden from entering. And this happened at a time when the prince was in a foul mood. The main character, still not noticing the stranger's presence nearby, sneezed loudly, causing the air to flinch. Not wanting to turn to face the guards, Michael asked what they were doing, to which one of the men excitedly asked what he meant. The prince, without further ado, ordered the two to hide, and they, frightened by his severity, loudly, almost shouting, answered that they would leave immediately. The young master asked them not to react so loudly, and they realized their mistake. Then the prince told his subordinates that they needed to bring him something. The guards panicked again, thinking that His Highness would ask them to bring either a sword or a sledgehammer to use on the girl. But in fact, Michael asked them to bring him a blanket, and some kind of soft one, not very thick. A few minutes later, the sweetly sleeping main character was covered with a warm pink blanket. The young heir, sitting down next to Eugene, thought about how carefree she was and how she really looked like a real dog waiting for her owner. The next day, as soon as morning came, the protagonist, feeling a surge of strength, stretched her arms upward. Then she sat up abruptly, delighted at how bright the morning was. The girl is happy that she no longer has routine work, no endlessly repetitive tasks, no piling up projects, no daily reports. Putting on a cute blue dress and hat and grabbing a picnic basket. The main character headed out into the garden, rejoicing at how wonderful life is. But suddenly, on her way, she meets a large black horse with a wheat-coloured mane who was looking at her from the fence. Eugene couldn't contain her delight at how beautiful the beast seemed to her. She covered her mouth in admiration and greeted the animal. But the stallion suddenly leaned his muzzle towards the lady's basket, as if he had smelled something delicious from there. The heroine realized that he was hungry, so she offered him an apple, which he ate with pleasure. Suddenly the slave heard someone's voice behind her, warily asking if anyone was there. Turning around, she saw a little boy hiding behind the stable door as if he was afraid of something. Eugene was confused by his sudden appearance, but she didn't forget to smile sweetly and say hello. The boy decided to approach the lady, saying he thought a horse thief had shown up while he was going to the toilet. But then the young man pointed out that, on the other hand, such a criminal wouldn't have been allowed into the palace. Suddenly, he remembered that they had not introduced themselves, after which he told the girl that his name was Hans, and he was learning to manage a stable under the supervision of Bernard. It was the slave's turn to introduce herself, but she hesitated, thinking that it was the first time she had seen a palace worker behaving in such a way. Deciding it was best not to say that she was simply lucky enough to meet the prince and become his dog, she simply introduced herself by her first name. He was slightly surprised by this, after which he said that there were a lot of horses in the stable and invited his new girlfriend to look at them, and she happily agreed. The next day, Eugene, dressed in a cute pink dress, stood in the hallway looking around, wondering where she should go today. She set her sights on several places at once, believing that the owner's house is her home too, and the dog never asked permission before going somewhere. But then the girl's sights were set on its target, Michael's office, where she decided to have a snack. The little girl opened the door and looked inside, deciding that if the prince had not wanted her to come in, he would have locked the door, although the smart dog would open it anyway. Suddenly, the slave noticed a cake on His Highness's table. Eugene didn't think his master liked sweets, but for some reason there was always one on the table. Joyfully sitting down at the table and grabbing a spoon, the dog thought that it didn't matter, and in any case it needed to be eaten, otherwise it would spoil. The real reason why there was always dessert on the prince's table was because it was his master's own order. He asked that desserts be saved for his pet. The servants obediently carried out the order. A few minutes later, the protagonist left the owner's room, pleased that she had been able to fill her belly here too. Then the girl thought about where she should go now, although she had already been to many places. Blondie is bored, walking back and forth, even though in her past life she loved playing on her phone. Now she remembers what she did when she didn't have one. An idea had formed in the dog's head, and she turned to the maid with a small request. The maid, as the young lady had asked, took her to the palace library, which contained more than 1,000 different books. The main character looked up in admiration at the tall shelves. Touching the spines of some of the publications, she saw that all the books here were written in Korean, her native language, which greatly comforted the little girl. But Eugene thought that this was not surprising, because she was in the world of a Korean game where she and all the other characters spoke Korean. However, the slave is unaccustomed to the way everyone looks here, including herself. Not to mention Michael, whose beauty is far from Korean. Suddenly, something made the main character emerge from her thoughts and look away. Not far from her, the girl saw His Highness, who was quietly dozing, comfortably seated on the sofa. Looking at the gentleman's face, the dog thought that he looked tired, and the emperor, who really doesn't know how to be a real parent, again dumped all the work on his son. The lady thought that Michael looked grown up, although he was still so young, but suddenly the sleeping prince frowned at that moment and mumbled something unintelligible. The main character approached the man and reached out to him with her hand, thinking that he was having nightmares. But at one point she froze, wondering whether she should wake up the master, whether she could do this at all, and where the line of what was permitted was. Suddenly the young man began to mumble something unintelligible again, which frightened the girl, and she pulled her hand away. In the end she decided that she was a pet after all, and didn't need to worry about such things, so she sat quietly next to the heir. Looking at the sleeping prince, the girl remembered that in the game, he was calmed when someone sat motionless next to him. The protagonist closed her eyes and blushed, thinking that this did not mean that she wanted to comfort the owner, and sat there only because it was warm near the fireplace. Eugene closed her eyes, deciding that she would take advantage of this strange coincidence if it would help His Highness get rid of his nightmares, without understanding how the main character dozed off, which caused her to lose her balance and rest her head on Michael's shoulder. This made the young gentleman wake up and then look at his dog, who continued to sleep. The man tried to move, but this resulted in the girl falling, dozing face down on his chest. The baby never woke up, continuing to sleep on the prince, which surprised him greatly, although he barely moved. Michael, calmly watching the girl snore, stroked her snow-white hair and then thought how warm she was. At this time, the main character in her old body lies in bed in the darkness, but then the alarm rings for 7 a.m. telling her to get up. The alarm clock kept ringing, but that only made things worse for the girl. She was sweating all over and muttering half asleep about how she had to go to work already. But suddenly she wakes up sharply in her former body from someone's words that if she needs to get up, then let her do so. Eugene saw His Majesty's face before her very close. The young man asked his pet if she was delirious. The protagonist screamed in surprise and wondered what was going on. The man, covering the girl's eyes with his hand, told her she could rest and that everything was fine. She obeyed him, but wondered what she was doing on his lap. Suddenly, the girl, thinking who would want this to continue, covered her forehead so that the gentleman could no longer touch her. However, from the drooping corners of the young man's lips, the young lady realized that this upset him. The little girl was embarrassed by the fact that the gentleman was looking her straight in the eyes, and she scratched her hair with her fingers, hinting that it would be better for him to stroke her hair. There was no trace left of the gentleman's sadness. He smiled, albeit imperceptibly. The heir began to stroke the pet's silky hair, and Eugene sighed with relief and thought that sometimes he should be allowed to enjoy the right to raise a pet. The heroine noticed she was starting to fall asleep, but her mood had lifted. But then she remembered she wanted to ask the owner something, which she did. The prince agreed to the girl's request, after which he said that it would be better for her to sleep. The dog fell asleep on the man's lap, remembering that he had promised to fulfill her request. The next day, the heroine, riding a horse that decided to snack on a tree, tells the animal that it cannot eat what grows in the garden. Eugene smiled smugly, proud that she had managed to ask the question before falling asleep. She remembers how it was. A girl lying on the gentleman's lap asks him for permission to ride a black and brown horse, and he allows her. Driving further, the lady thinks that a living creature is a completely different matter, and before approaching another person's animal, you need to ask the owner's permission. Having ridden the horse to her heart's content, the girl drove it into the enclosure, saying a sweet goodbye and affectionately calling the mare Ding Ding. The pet hurried to the palace, but limped along the way because she had sprained her leg. She enjoys horseback riding, though it's a challenging sport. But suddenly, Eugene, walking along the corridor of the stable, notices something to her right that really interests her. Among the pile of all sorts of garden things, the girl noticed a hammock and a hanging swing that were lying on the floor as if no one needed them. The protagonist was overjoyed by the find and realized she simply had to hang them next to her gazebo shelter. She decided to ride them first and then go to sleep. Very quickly, the girl came to her gazebo to bring her idea to life. But suddenly she stopped and frowned because one strange thing alerted her. The little girl doesn't understand why no matter how hard she ties the hammock to the tree, it still falls. The lady thinks there's something wrong with the hammock, The same thing happens when she changes the tree where she could hang it. The heroine decides not to despair and instead of a hammock, try hanging a swing. After some time, Eugene found the perfect tree with a thick branch, which made her very happy. However, this branch turned out to be so high that the dog could not even reach it with his hand. The girl was so upset by this that she threw the swing on the ground, leaving it there, and went back to the palace. A few minutes later, His Highness decided to come to the gazebo along with 2 guards. But suddenly, the prince noticed an abandoned hammock and swing on the road. The man asked the servants what they were. One of the subordinates suggested that they had tried to hang a hammock and swing on this tree, but there was no ladder, and it would not have been possible to tie it with such a rope. Michael looked closely at that very tree, after which he ordered the guards to cut it down immediately. At first, they were frightened by such a sudden and cold-blooded order from the master, but they agreed to fulfill the request. That very moment, the servants armed themselves with an axe and cut down the tree, which by evening was no longer in the garden. The next day, Eugene came to her shelter gazebo again, but stopped as what she saw left her in shock. The girl's brow began to sweat in numbness. She anxiously asked herself what had happened. The young lady began pacing the garden, examining it carefully. She couldn't remember it looking like this, as there seemed to be more trees. Her pet thought she was imagining things because of her mood. The heroine saw that near her favorite gazebo, there was now a magnificent children's swing and a hammock of unearthly beauty. Eugene was so delighted by this that she pressed her palms to her chest and gasped. Her eyes had never sparkled like this before. First, the child rode on the swing, which brought him a lot of joyful emotions. Then the girl plopped down on the air cushions that lined the hammock, and she couldn't help but be overjoyed. The pet spotted several of her favorite desserts and an iced drink nearby. The sight of her favorite sweets made the blonde drool. Eugene settled comfortably on the hammock, snacking on desserts and mentally giving the service at the palace a thumbs up and leaving a pleasant 5-star review. A few days later, the protagonist was still lounging on her lounger, but she had taken with her the book Song of the Blue Sea, which she wanted to read. She smiled and thought that she was very surprised when she saw the panoramic book in the office. As soon as the dog opened the magic book, a spell immediately rose into the air from its pages, which depicted the entire plot of the story in blue light. The young lady was very struck by their beauty, but almost immediately closed the book back and lowered her head. Eugene hugged the publishing house to her chest and shed a tear at the beauty she saw, after which she cried out in admiration that the author of this creation was a genius. The little girl immediately ran to the palace to find and read the next such book, but suddenly she stopped because her attention was drawn to some closed doors, which were covered with a beautiful fresco. The heroine remembered that apparently this was her first time in this corridor, which meant that there were still places in the castle that she had never been to. Upon closer inspection of the drawing on the doors, she realized it depicted the victory of humans over the beastmen. She couldn't understand why the losers were depicted larger than the victors. Opening the door slightly and looking into the room, the heroine did not see anything unusual that would surprise her. However, when she walked through the apartment, she noticed a white piano against the wall. The girl immediately sat down on the chair and tapped on the hard keys, imitating a real pianist. But instead of a melody, she produced an unintelligible gibberish. Suddenly, a sound behind her interrupted her pet's amusement. Eugene froze and listened. Turning around, she saw nothing, only a candlestick and many shelves with books. Thanks to the piano and the bookcase in the room, a puzzle began to form in the protagonist's mind. She thoughtfully approached the bookcases, noticing one spine that stood out because it stuck out a little. The girl pressed on it, hoping that it was the key that would open the secret room. For a second, the protagonist thought she would be able to find what she wanted, but when she pressed the spine, nothing happened in front of her. However, as soon as she turned around, thinking it was an ordinary wall, the bookshelf suddenly opened. Unfortunately, the opening door to the secret room also drew the young lady along with it. In an instant, the heroine found herself locked in a secret room, while outside there seemed to be no trace of her. Some time later, the young master noticed his pet was missing, which didn't please him. He angrily asked his subordinates if they had found her. The butler, nervously bowing his head, replied that they were still searching. Then the prince asked if they had tried tracking the location, to which he replied that a magician would soon arrive for that. The servant, sweating with fear, recalls that he always kept an eye on the dog with the eye of protection provided by His Highness, but everything went wrong. How did the process of caring for the pet take place? The maid tells her colleague that food for Eugene is almost ready, and she says that she is in the garden. Another servant reported to Michael that the girl was resting in the garden, and the butler promised to go for her, but the master said that he would go for her himself. The young man returned from the garden holding his sleeping dog in his arms. Thanks to her owner, the main character returned safely to her bed. But now, Michael, remembering how Eugene ate in his office, thinks that she was a pet who carelessly stomped around and stretched out her muzzle. The heir remembered how she, sitting on a small table and eating sweets, joyfully greeted him, calling him her master. But now for him, these are just memories, and in reality, the girl has disappeared without a trace. This made the gentleman very angry, but he convinced himself that everything was fine, and that she would be found soon, since her shackles contained magic, just for such an occasion. Suddenly, the doors to the prince's office swung open, and a servant shouted that the imperial magician had arrived. Michael immediately went to him and asked about Eugene's location, but he apologized and said that the genie engraved on the medallion was not responding. His Highness inquired what this meant, and the magician admitted that, to be more precise, he was reacting, but was stuck in a place from where he could not transmit a signal, and it was likely that the medallion was being obstructed by a spell. The wizard shared his suspicions with the young gentleman, but the prince himself already understood that this might be a kidnapping. The heir clenched his jaw in anger because he had hired a magician for an exorbitant price who had done almost nothing to help, and someone had even dared to kidnap his pet. The prince ordered all soldiers to disperse immediately, as the kidnapper couldn't have gotten far. The man promised to tear the culprit to shreds. The protagonist, meanwhile, is dozing in the darkness on the cold stone floor. But at one point, after sleeping for an unknown amount of time, she finally opened her eyes. Having risen from the floor, the girl wondered where she was because she saw nothing in front of her, only pitch darkness. She began to try to feel something on the floor with her hands, and she succeeded. Her fingers touched some object. As soon as the heroine took this soft object in her hands, it began to emit a faint light. The lump in the lady's hands glowed when she crumpled it, which made her think that it was a thermal pack that people put in their pockets to keep their fingers from freezing. The lost one looked around again, and although she couldn't see anything further than her outstretched arm, she realized that she was in some kind of library. Eugene realized she was Michael's pet, but she wondered if they would look for her. The pet decided to wait, because they say if you're lost, you should stay put. However, after a few minutes, the little girl noticed that the little bundle in her hands began to glow less brightly, which meant that it would fade over time. The heroine resolutely rose to her feet, because soon she might be left without her only source of light, so she couldn't just sit here. The dog thought that perhaps this secret passage was built especially for the imperial family, and it was supposed to lead to a safe place. Belobrisca walked carefully down the corridor, assuring herself that everything would be fine. The girl kept walking and walking along the stone floor, noticing that her thermal pack was getting dimmer and dimmer. Suddenly, the lost girl saw a doorway in the distance with light shining through. Eugene was overjoyed because she had finally found a way out. The main character rushed to the door as fast as she could and quickly opened it with her hand. The pet looked out of the opening, but with her eyes closed, because she was very afraid to see what was there. But suddenly, as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw in front of her a pair of blue cat eyes that were staring at her. The young lady was speechless from surprise and simply stared at the beast in bewilderment. The owner of the gorgeous blue eyes turned out to be a small white tiger cub who was heading towards the protagonist with interest. Eugene was so touched by this handsome man that she covered her mouth with her hands in admiration. The animal ran around the girl studying her, and the pet remembered that this tiger cub was called Kun, and in the mobile game, he was drawn as an adult. While Kun didn't influence the game's plot, he was still featured on the title card. The creators drew every detail of his artwork, making him look magnificent. Looking around the room, she had entered the dog. Thought that if she had met a tiger cub here, then this was most likely Princess Raphaela's chambers. The little girl remembered that Raphaela was a minor character in the game who appeared from time to time, so it was difficult to determine her role in the story. Eugene's attention was drawn to the laboratory equipment on the table, and she assumed that the owner of the room was researching magical medicines. Then the heroine noticed a stack of papers on the table with the text that interested her. But as soon as the blonde took the papers in her hands, what she read left her in shock. Suddenly, Eugene heard a voice behind her asking who she was. The girl turned around, alarmed. Behind her, the protagonist saw an expensively dressed young girl with blonde hair who was stroking a white tiger cub in her hands, while the little dog, instead of introducing herself, blushed and happily called Raphaela Ryder because the papers she was holding in her hand were a continuation of her favorite book, The Song of the Blue Sea. The princess was startled by the unexpected guest's cry and asked what she was talking about. Sometime later, Raphaela and Eugene were chatting together, where the heroine told her mistress how much she admired her book. She thanked her by feeding her sweets. Bellabriska continued to say that she did not expect such an ending to the book, to which the princess only smiled modestly and asked her to chew it well. His Highness's sister looked at the protagonist and remembered that she was the girl about whom the rumors were circulating. Suddenly the pet froze, covering her mouth with her hands as if she felt something unusual in her mouth while chewing the dessert. The worried princess asked her what it was and whether she liked the food, thinking that she did not need a cook who was unable to please a child. But instead of complaining, Eugene said that she really likes this sweet and spicy dessert because she hasn't eaten delicious Korean food for a long time. Raphaela smiled and told her friend that it was a colorful fruit, and they had a lot of it in stock, so she was allowed to eat as much as she wanted. The lady said they had some juicy apples in the warehouse and suggested her friend go there, which she agreed to. The girls left the room, but suddenly the little girl saw two servants in the corridor who were discussing the disappearance of a dog from the neighboring palace, but did not suspect that it was actually a person. The pet wondered how much time had passed since she left, and whether they were already looking for her. Then the heroine was struck by the thought of whether Prince Michael was worried about her. But the girl forced herself to throw these thoughts out of her head, since this couldn't be true, since she was not the main character in this game. Eugene apologized to the princess and said that it was time for her to go home. The smile disappeared from Raphaela's face, but she extended her hand to the child and asked if she had come from Michael's palace, and if so, she could show her the way. Suddenly, a sly smile appeared on the lady's face again, and she thought that she too had something to say to her brother. The doggy happily agreed, and together with her friend went to her native palace. Meanwhile, the search for the missing girl is still ongoing at Prince Michael's palace. The palace workers gathered around His Highness, who, pointing a sword at his servant, said that not only had he lost what belonged to him, but he still had not found any clues. The subordinate trembled and sweated profusely from the sword's blade. Being so close to his throat, he tried to somehow convince his master. But the prince, looking at him angrily, asked why he needed a head on his shoulders if he was so useless. The man swung his sword, after which only a terrifying human scream could be heard. Butler Bartell always considered himself lucky to work in the prince's palace, because unlike the imperial one, at least here no one was killed for mistakes. But that's what he thought until today, when Michael pointed his sword at his guilty servant. But as soon as His Highness swung his sword, he froze when he heard the voice of a girl behind him who called him master. Turning around, he saw Yujin looking at him as if nothing had happened. The subordinates gathered around her were overjoyed at her return. Michael took his sword away from the guilty servant whose whole life flashed before his eyes. The prince carefully scanned every hair, every thread, every centimeter of his pet's skin. The man exhaled because at first glance the girl had no injuries, only minor dirt stains on her clothes. Meanwhile, the dog looked around excitedly, not understanding why there was such a tense atmosphere and why everyone had gathered here. The young lady decided that her intuition was right, and at times like these, retreat was the most effective tactic, which is what she was about to do. But suddenly she was stopped by the princess, who, amazed at the chaos around her, called out to the prince. Yujin was surprised by this because it turned out that Raphaela had not just brought her home in her carriage and escorted her there for no reason. His Highness was so surprised by his sister's appearance that he frowned in bewilderment and stared at her. The young man asked her what was going on, and the lady said that the girl had asked to be taken back, and she had decided to accompany her, but she also had something to tell him. Michael continued to look at his sister, wondering why she had decided to accompany her pet all the way to the palace. Meanwhile, Raphaela gave her maid a special gesture, and she opened the cage, which was covered with a white cloth, and lay in the carriage. The princess picked up her tiger cub, who jumped out of the cage and called out to the main character. The girl then gave her animal into the child's hands, after which she carefully looked at how they looked. The lady walked towards Yujin, saying that she looked good with her tiger, so she wanted to take her for herself, which stunned the prince. Gently touching the girl's cheek, the princess said that she already had a tiger cub, but asked if she would like to become her kitten. But suddenly, Michael, shielding his pet with himself, asked his sister, who had told her that his dog could become his cat. She replied that she liked the heroine as she was very sweet. The lady explained to her brother that she was there to discuss this with him as she bore his seal. The man said it was nonsense, but the princess, pointing her finger at the girl's shackles, asked why she was wearing such a simple necklace. Raphael says that Yujin would look much better wearing a necklace with her seal edged with a silver vine to highlight the beauty of her neck. However, Michael pulled his sister's hand away from his pet, ordering her not to touch it. The prince decided to go to the palace as quickly as possible, and taking the child with him, he told the princess that he could not take her back because he was very busy. But the protagonist slowed down, remembering that she had Kun in her arms. She lowered the beast to the ground. Raphaela called her pet to her, and the tiger cub ran to his owner. Looking back at the departing prince with the girl, the lady thought that nothing could be done, but she would still have a chance. Her Highness sat down in her carriage, which drove back to the girl's palace. The main character found herself in the prince's office, where she sat down on the sofa opposite him with Michael. She wondered why they had come here. She wanted to get it over with and take a shower. The lady looked at the sullen gentleman who seemed lost in thought. The pet assumed he was angry because his father had overloaded him with work again. The pet smiled shyly, since she only sees her owner when she is looking for a meeting with him, so she cannot read his facial expression. The little girl remembered that in the original countess got to the bottom of things, and Eugene is sure that Michael won't get attached to her because she's not the main character. But suddenly His Highness spoke. He asked the child what had happened and how she had left the palace, and then returned with the princess. The doggy immediately waved her hands because she could share this with the gentleman, which is what she had promised him. In a few minutes the girl told how she found the room with the piano, through which she entered the secret corridor, and where she came out into the room with Kuni. The prince answered his pet with a simple, "I understand," after which he allowed her to go and rest, which the young lady was very happy about. Evening came, and the prince, placing the scroll on his desk, told his butler that he would put it aside for a while. The man ordered the servant to contact the knights and open the passage in his room from the other room and clean everything there. The subordinate believed Michael's order because initially, the princess was supposed to live in that room until she was crowned. He replied that these chambers weren't in use anyway. The prince realized he no longer trusted the people watching over Eugene, but if she was in the next room, he could visit her himself. The protagonist, seeing her new luxurious room, asked in shock if she would sleep here now. The maid replied that it was then told the lady that she had brought her pillow and would also bring food soon. The lady thanked her. Eugene realized her owner wanted to change her kennel. The girl fell onto the bed, delighted that it was bigger and softer here, and the room itself was huge. Suddenly, the girl heard someone knocking on her room door, which made her immediately get up and allow the person to enter, thinking that they had brought her food. But instead of a maid with a tray, 2 knights entered, a man with brown hair and a girl with black hair. The heroine stared at the strangers, wondering who they could be since she had never seen them before. The man, meanwhile, leaned over to the heroine, said hello, and asked with a smile if she was the dog they had been told about. Suddenly, the female knight silenced her colleague by slapping his face with her palm. The lady, walking up to the blonde, asked Felix to calm down, and he, rubbing his reddened face, obeyed her since she was the eldest in the group. The female knight kneeled before Eugene and said that by His Highness's order, they would accompany her from today on as her guards. The main character's eyes sparkled as she saw real knights in front of her, just like from a real fantasy novel. She got out of bed and bowed politely to them, said hello, and stated her name. Without straightening her back, the girl glanced at the guards, wondering if she had bowed correctly since she did it the way she knew how. Suddenly, Felix leaned towards the lady again, which frightened her greatly, and said that from now on they were her escorts. The man introduced himself and said he was a swordsman with a strong, sturdy frame. He allowed the child to call him Mr. or Lord Felix, but his girlfriend sternly ordered him to stop playing around. The knight, trembling with fear at the evil expression on his partner's face, said that he would not do it again and asked the girl not to make faces like that anymore. Felix decided to introduce himself to the dog properly, so he kneeled before her and said that from today on he would protect her. Then the young man stood up and asked his friend if he had done everything right, but she simply ignored him. The main character approached the table and asked Knight Hartin to sit down. The girl paid attention only to the woman and didn't even glance at the man. The guard thanked the little girl for her hospitality. Eugene asked her if she had eaten today, and she, forgetting about Felix, said no. The girl excitedly asked the night girl how she would feel about eating with her. The saddened man did not answer, and Hartin said with a smile that she would be only too happy to accept her offer. At the request of the doggy, the servants quickly set the table in her chambers, consisting of delicious desserts and meat appetizers. The protagonist ate the food with pleasure, thinking that she really enjoyed eating in company, especially with such cool knights. The girl admired Hartin, who was calmly enjoying her meal. Eugene, meanwhile, didn't even glance at the other knight. Suddenly, the blonde became interested in something and asked her favorite if she liked sweets, because she had been eating them ever since she sat down at the table. The girl blushed and replied that as a knight she should avoid variety in food, but sugar was necessary to replenish energy. But Felix said with a smile that his colleague was simply afraid of gluttony, and she was the only one who so strictly adhered to the knightly commandments. She sheepishly asked her colleague to speak more quietly, and the pet, admiringly covering her mouth with her hands, thought that the fact that Hartin secretly had a passion for sweets was very cute. The heroine handed the security guard a piece of cake with strawberry sweet cream and delicate sponge cake and offered to try it. But when the child wanted to try some of this dessert herself, her hand accidentally jerked, causing the girl's nose to get stained with cream. Noticing this, the girl knight did not leave the little lady in trouble and offered her help. Wiping the cream off the doggy's face with a napkin, Hartin smiled and said that it looked much better. The protagonist stared at the woman with loving eyes, thinking that even her boyfriend in her past life had never done that. Felix, silently watching the conversation between the two ladies, thought that the little girl's eyes were shining when she looked at his friend. Suddenly, Eugene finally looked away from her pet and met the man's gaze. The knight decided not to miss the opportunity to wink coquettishly at the girl, but she just turned away in disgust, sticking out her tongue, but despite this, the guard continued to laugh at her. As Felix picked at his food, he thought about how this was complete discrimination, and while he didn't like the task, it wasn't that bad. The young man believes that Knight Hartin would not waste time in such a place. Having demonstrated a talent for fencing as a child, she moved from the village to the city. She possesses a rare talent and is the youngest knight to take the oath. This girl is the first to defeat the Wyvern, and for the countless missions she has completed, she has been nicknamed the Invincible Legend. Felix recalls that when he first decided to join the order, he was very outraged by the way he was treated and by the other knights in general. The man is unhappy that they are first forced to perform menial tasks and then sent to watch the dog, although this was expected since he is not in favor with the imperial family. Meanwhile, the main character happily asked the girl if she wanted to try some hot chocolate. She said that she would not refuse her offer, after which she thanked the girl. Eugene beamed even brighter and said enthusiastically that she also liked hot chocolate. Felix, looking at his pet, thinks that it was a clever trick because he was afraid that he and his colleague would become servants for the girl, but it seems that everything is not so. The man also remembers that he needs to get a copy of Hartin's collected works, and it seems to him that he can talk about this with the little girl. The knight thought so until Eugene pointed her finger at him and happily declared that he was now bankrupt. He sweated with excitement and stunned, asked how this was possible. He asked her not to say that, then asked why he didn't have enough money. It turns out the girl and her guards were playing a board game about business. The young lady said it was because he'd squandered everything. The pet, enjoying his opponent's loss, says that this is what an aristocracy is for, and he doesn't even know how the banks take interest from him. The dog spent a lot of time watching Felix at games, but he whose physical strength, status, and education were not comparable to hers always won her, be it a knight's duel cards or Kulonzui. In the end, the girl decided that she was an unlucky person, and her opponent was simply invincible. But at the very last moment, the heroine remembered that the main thing in the game is establishing balance, and in a game where everyone has a chance, she has an ace up her sleeve. Bellobriska gave herself a name, a professional in Purima, a board game about Monopoly. Looking at the knight, the girl thinks that this man who has lost his luck in the game has an understanding of economics on the level of an educated aristocracy. Hartin explained that real estate and valuables should be purchased in accordance with status, and if he spends more than he earns, he will go bankrupt. Felix asked if he had any territory left, but Eugene said that even if they added it all up, it wouldn't be enough and the bank wouldn't help him. The girl added that noble families use their debt as an asset, but she doesn't believe that this is so deeply ingrained in society. The guards began to argue about which of them was smarter, and the protagonist kept laughing. Living alone in the palace was not bad, but she had much more fun with them. Meanwhile, Prince Michael, stopping near the table where his pet usually dined, began to think seriously about something. The young man can't understand why she doesn't touch the desserts that he regularly leaves for her in his office. The next day, a servant handed His Highness a letter and said that a request had been received from Sir Bowrin, the commander of the Knights of the Imperial Palace. The master asked if he wanted to dispatch the Imperial Knights, to which the subordinate replied yes, as the matter was urgent. The prince inquired where the commander was, and he replied that he was on the parade ground. Then Michael rose from his chair, admitting that he wanted to stretch his legs a little, and invited the servant to go with him to Bowrin. A few minutes later, the heir opened the doors of the training ground, from which the sounds of fighting could be heard. He walked down the corridor and stopped to watch Felix and Hartin practicing swordplay against each other. But suddenly, the gentleman's attention was drawn to something else. His dog was watching his favorite with incredible delight, admiring her every movement. The man realized that the girl had been there all this time and that she looked good. Meanwhile, the night's battle had ended. Hartin defeated her opponent by pressing her blade to his throat. The man's sword flew off with a clang. Yujin, seeing that the girl in her heart had won, clapped her hands joyfully. But at that moment, His Highness suddenly became alert and listened to what his pet was saying. The little girl, offering the girl a towel and offering her the chance to wipe the sweat from her face, said she'd done a great job. Hartin, smiling, said no. Michael was so angered by what he saw that he dug his fingers into the stone wall, causing cracks. He says the girl has become too attached to them. Suddenly, a man appeared next to the heir, Sabourin. The knight asked his lord why he hadn't called him immediately. The prince said he'd seen his letter and asked if he needed a talented warrior. He answered decisively that it was so, thinking that His Highness was using Hartin as a pet escort and he should take her away. The commander was about to explain to the gentleman how he needed a strong knight, but he suddenly, without hesitation, replied that he would allow him to take the girl. The man fell silent because he was alarmed by how easily the prince agreed, and this meant that there was some kind of catch. Borin said that he didn't have to take her, since that wasn't the only way to solve the problem, but the prince angrily reminded her that Hartin was the strongest of them all. The knight did not argue with Michael any further, and bowing his head before him, thanked him for everything. Looking at his pet, the young heir thought about how the importance of this mission had just increased and that it was about sending him to distant distances. The prince understands that it is natural to become close to someone you spend a lot of time with, but that too much closeness can interfere with the completion of the task. From those events to the palace of His Highness, several days flew by unnoticed. Felix, putting his head on the table and still crying, calls his senior partner. The heroine who is sitting opposite him asks her friend to calm down, because several days have already passed since Hartin's departure, and it is unknown when she will return. The man sadly replied that that was okay, but told the girl that even though the older one was not there, she still did not call him sir. The pet told the knight that he was pathetic, and that his girlfriend was chosen based on her skills, and a true fan should wish her success in her work. He replied that he was aware of it. Felix wanted to say something else, but his crying broke out again, greatly upsetting the protagonist. Eugene thought he was a fool if he thought she didn't miss her beloved Hartin. Meanwhile, the prince sitting at his office desk was deep in thought about something so much so that he frowned. Michael's thoughts were preoccupied with the only thing that hadn't happened yet if he'd eliminated the guard. The butler, noticing the master's menacing expression, anxiously asked if everything was all right. The young heir ordered his servant to call Knight Felix, and a few minutes later he arrived in His Highness's office and greeted him properly. Michael asked the man if it was true that his dog didn't get out of bed all day, to which he said that it was true. The guard's answer made the prince think, which gave him an interesting idea. Eugene, wrapped in her favorite blanket like a cocoon, has finally completed her introspection and is ready to take stock. Her life had been busy in recent days, obsessed with Hartin, but she always remembers that a life of hard work is not for her. The heroine spends every day wasting her time, and she really likes it. The life of a carefree dog suits her perfectly. 3 meals a day, snacks, and a ton of books. She doesn't even have to leave her room to get it, because the service here is like a 5-star hotel. But suddenly, the girl shuddered because she heard the door to her room open and someone enter her room. Turning around, the little girl saw His Highness walking straight towards her and Felix closing the door behind him. The dog stared at the gentleman with her large grey eyes in surprise, wondering why he had visited her chambers. She, remembering that she had completely forgotten to clean up after herself, immediately assumed that the owner would scold her for the mess in the room. But Michael, looking at her pet, thinks that apparently she is still upset about her pet's departure, and that's why she locked herself in her room. Suddenly, out of the blue, the prince asked the girl if she liked to walk. She shook her head questioningly and asked what he meant, thinking that this question came from him somehow, suddenly. But Michael suddenly became embarrassed, turning away and covering his face with his hand. He wondered why he'd said that, because no matter how much he'd called Eugene doggy, she wasn't an animal to be walked. The protagonist thought that her master's suddenness was a little annoying, but he was the one who fed her, so she asked with a smile if they would go for a walk. Looking into the eyes of the puzzled prince, the girl realized that his expression was a pleasant incentive to get out of bed. But His Highness suddenly turned and walked away, telling the child it wasn't worth it and that she should rest. She gaped in surprise. The confused girl asked Felix where he had gone to, which he was unable to answer. Some time passed. Michael was busy working with his sister, sorting through the letters of request, deciding which families to assign them to. Then a servant entered the prince and princess's room and informed the latter that all preparations were ready. The brother inquired as to the purpose. The girl apologized to him for interrupting his work, but promised to take care of it later since she had urgent business. The prince asked irritably what urgent matter she could have at such a moment, but the girl, taking her pet and the bottle of milk that the maids brought in her arms, said with a smile that it was time to feed her baby. The gentleman was surprised and slightly angered by the real reason, but he did not object to his sister. While feeding Kun milk, Raphaela asks her brother if her tiger is a cutie, then says that if she feeds him like that, he will recognize her as his owner. Michael, looking at the animal, thought that it was cute, although compared to his doggy, it was insignificant. After feeding Kun, the princess showed him a bunch of his new toys and said that they were all for him, and if he wanted to play, he could do so right now. The well-fed tiger cub began to play with pleasure, clinging to the soft ball with his claws. The lady, lifting her baby into her arms, playfully asked him who was spoiling him so much, then answered that it was she, his mistress, after which she asked the tiger to remember her. His Highness was surprised by this beast, and it seemed that he realized something for himself. The main character, having arrived at the office where the owner had called her, was dumbfounded by what she saw. She saw that countless jewels, expensive accessories, and majestic statues were laid out on the tables. Looking at this, the girl thought an event was being prepared. Here Michael, who was sitting among his servants, told his pet to choose whatever he wanted. The dog pointed her finger at herself and asked if he was telling her that, and he said yes. Looking at the jewelry, the protagonist thought that the gentleman was tired of choosing himself, and now she would do it. Because of this, Eugene decided she had to choose what he would like. But she didn't know what to choose from expensive furniture, jewelry, perfume, and dresses. Finally, the little girl grabbed a piece of expensive, shiny blue fabric and told the owner that this was what she was choosing. But the prince suddenly asked irritably if she was choosing only one thing from all of these. The girl, realizing that there shouldn't be just one thing and that he apparently didn't like her choice, chose an exquisite handwritten set. But the young heir, becoming even more angry, said that it seemed that his dog was useless since it could not bring anything useful. It finally dawned on the pet that His Highness wanted to give all these things to her, and he scolded her for not choosing enough gifts for herself. The servant immediately began to apologize to the master and admitted that they had prepared only the best, but he continued to be angry. The heroine sighed to gather her strength because she decided that she would not leave this merchant in trouble because it was not in her interests yet. Without thinking, the girl ran her finger over all the things laid out on the tables. After this, she decisively declared that she would take all these riches for herself. But suddenly, the prince and his subordinate stared silently at the little girl, causing her to shudder. The heroine looked away in embarrassment and wondered if she had done everything right and whether she had gone too far. But Michael, having stopped frowning, told his pet that her wish would be fulfilled. His Highness asked the merchant if there were any more items, and he replied that there were. Eugene froze in place, unable to believe what she had accomplished. The man suggested that the child look at the author's other works, which she liked, but she didn't listen to him at all, because she was over the moon that the owner was giving her all this luxury. The young master, seeing the happy eyes of his pet, smiled smugly An hour later, the main character, having finished decorating the prince's palace with recently purchased things, happily declared that she had done just fine. But suddenly the girl realized that she wanted to show off her interior in avant-garde and postmodern style to someone. Remembering that the owner had bought these things, she ran to him, deciding that if he had spent money on her, he needed to account for it, so she would show him the room. Peeking into his office, the little girl saw him working. Michael noticed the pet's appearance but paid no attention. The lady approached him and the gentleman wondered what had happened that she had come to him so suddenly. He pretended not to notice her so as not to frighten her. The protagonist realized that His Highness was busy, so she decided to wait a little and sat down on the sofa nearby. Minute after minute passed and the hands on the clock already showed 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The doggie waited so long for her owner to be free that she lay down on her side and fell asleep. But suddenly she felt that the prince sitting down on the sofa next to her began to stroke her hair. The girl's cheeks blushed because she really liked it when the gentleman stroked her head. Suddenly a sharp sound made the main character instantly open her eyes. Rising to her feet, Eugene saw that Michael had already finished his work and stood up from the table, and everything that had happened to her before was just her dream. The young man went out into the corridor and went about his business, and the dog followed right behind him. But then the prince noticed that his pet had rushed ahead of him to the door of the room that she had decorated in her avant-garde artistic style. Having reached the place, Eugene opened the doors and stood next to her and looked at the owner. The little girl shyly asked him if he wanted to look at the gifts she had received. He, having guessed what the girl wanted from him, nodded silently and walked towards her. When the man entered the room, he was in no hurry to say anything right away, and the butler and 2 guards who stood behind him were sweating with fear. The subordinates, seeing what was happening in the room, were sure that the young master would be angry and would definitely get mad. It turned out that the entire room was filled with jewelry, with stones, accessories, Greek statues, with peacock feathers, and cacti. The heroine happily told the man that this was the concept of a fun and happy lounge that she had carefully planned. But the butler at this time was dumbfounded with fear, thinking about what a tasteless, shiny thing this girl had turned the magnificence of the palace into. But to the servant's great surprise, His Highness knocked down his pet, which made her very happy. Eugene suggested that the owner sort things out in order, and began telling her which side offered a good view of the statue, while on the other side one could notice the unicorns. The girl, watching the calm expression on Michael's face, suddenly thought that when she was next to him, he seemed softer to her than in the game. Some time later, the prince, while at another meeting, angrily asked his father what he wanted to tell him. The emperor told his son that he had ordered him to make a lake that would be filled with rainwater. He asked if he was talking about remodeling the garden of the imperial palace, and the king replied that he was, and that he would like this lake as soon as possible. The ruler asked Lord Onicourt, who was sitting next to him, how many days it would take to build, but he hesitated. But then another gentleman said that if we were talking about the lake, they already had something that was famous for its beauty, and he could suggest a design option. Those present began to argue about whose lake was more beautiful, but the prince did not seem at all surprised. Michael was initially calm because it was his father standing before him, but he was driven mad by his father's arrogance and the arrogance of his henchmen towards him. When the meeting ended, the enraged heir ran to his office, ordering his servants to publish descriptions of the families they had spoken of. Having reached his room, the prince opened the doors, wanting to be alone as soon as possible. But the young man never expected to see his dog in his office, enjoying desserts at her small table. Michael was so surprised by her presence that he stood frozen in place, staring at the girl in amazement. But the next moment the man turned away in embarrassment, covering his face with his hand. But a cold sweat ran across the heir's face. He couldn't believe that Eugene saw him in such a state. Michael, without saying a word, sat down on the sofa in the corner away from his pet. The heroine, sitting at her table and smiling, Shyly thought that this was the first time she had seen the gentleman so angry. The girl remembers that if you touch him in this state, he will destroy everyone. The little girl suddenly thought that this expression on his face was very familiar, as if she had seen it somewhere before, and then she remembered that he was so angry in the game. Putting his fork down on the table, Eugene remembers that he always had that expression on his face in the game, but now she feels a bit awkward seeing it. Looking at the lonely prince, the dog wondered if everything was all right. She felt like the emperor had dumped all the work on his son again. Here the girl got up from the table and ran to the shelves, with books which were located next to the sofa on which the owner was sitting. She glanced out of the corner of her eye at the man who turned away from her in embarrassment. The little lady thought he looked very tired. The heroine suddenly remembered that although her parents from her past life had died in an accident before, that they had managed to give her a lot of love which could not be said about His Highness. Watching the prince, the girl thinks he's still young even though he's already under so much stress. She wonders if his master knows how to get rid of him. The protagonist pursed her lips in embarrassment, having decided to do Michael a favor. After all, he should be enjoying his pet. His Highness suddenly heard a sudden question from the dog. Could he pet her head? As soon as the man wanted to ask her what she meant, she happily lay down on his lap. The young man stared at the child in surprise, his ears blushing. The little girl, seeing this, covered her lips in admiration. She truly couldn't believe the gentleman's ears had turned red. She recalls that in games it is very rare for a character's ears to turn red rather than their face. Eugene, realizing that her plan had worked, smiled smugly, then mentally ordered her master to stroke her head. He fulfilled his pet's request and began to gently stroke her snow-white hair with his palm. Enjoying the sensation, the girl decided to take a peek out of the corner of her eye to see if her owner's mood had improved. The little girl saw that His Highness was looking into her eyes, smiling faintly. The child remembers that he is always silent and looks into her eyes when she speaks, but remembers every little detail that her other interlocutors forget. Eugene smiled, hoping the prince would have as good a day as she had. She thought it would be great if she could support her master if he had any difficulties. Several days passed, and the heroine, carefreely admiring the window, thinks that she no longer knows how much time has passed since Hartin left. During all this time out of boredom, she managed to reread all the books and play cards with Felix, who was already tired of his constant victories. While admiring the scenery, the doggy decides that he needs to do something to pass the time. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that one cloud in the sky looks very much like Kun's paw. Surprised by such a similarity, the girl jumped to her feet because a brilliant idea came to her that would save her from boredom. She cheerfully invited Felix to go see Kun. He asked if she wanted to go to the princess's chambers, and she said yes. The little girl ran to the exit, but the knight suddenly blocked her path, not forgetting to grab his sword. The smile vanished from Eugene's face. She looked at the man in surprise, wanting to ask what he was doing, but Felix suddenly told the girl sternly that she could not go there, after which he asked her to return to her place. The girl was angered by this and angrily asked the guy not to joke about her like that. He replied that he wasn't joking, but simply doing his job. The guard explained to the lady that since she was a pet, she should remain in the palace and live like one. The little girl looked at the knight in bewilderment because she thought that they had become friends. Eugene asked if he was giving her orders. Now Felix was taken aback and flinched at the unexpected questions. The girl furiously asked the guy who he was to tell her what to do, to which he asked her to calm down. Suddenly, a smiling Hartin enters the room and asks the young lady how she is doing. But just then, the dog screamed and asked Felix why he was giving her orders if he wasn't her master. An awkward silence fell between the two. The puzzled girl said that she came in to say hello and then would go to report on the completion of the mission, but asked her colleague what had happened. But suddenly the prince's dog rushed into the guard's arms, barely holding back her tears. A minute later, the knight explained to her friend that his job was to protect and accompany. The girl asked him why he was threatening the child. Eugene, watching her favorite from the sidelines, enjoys watching her scold. Felix, she silently begs her friend to punish him more severely. The man sheepishly bowed his head to his colleague and said that he would improve. Hartin ordered him to go and find out if it was possible to borrow a carriage so that they could go to the princess's palace. And he obeyed. The knight, wandering along the corridor, complains about how hot-tempered the little one is, and it turns out that she is quite the villain, and his colleague returned on time. The young man thinks that Eugene is like this because she only thinks about herself. Felix understands that no matter how much the prince cares for her in the palace, even ordinary servants have a higher status than commoners. And this child, whose status is that of a slave, behaves as if she is not in any danger even outside the palace. The man reasons that no matter how much he protects her, it is impossible to save her from the wounds that hurtful words can leave. The guard recalled a situation that had happened a few days earlier. An unknown man from the palace grabbed the girl by the face and told her that she was a slave. The stranger with the mustache looked at the blonde in bewilderment and wondered why the prince liked her, even though her hair was not such a perfect white color. The main character, frozen in bewilderment, suddenly wondered what status this gentleman had. While the mustachioed uncle was indignant about why His Highness chose Eugene, the girl made a quick analysis, carefully studying the man's appearance. She finally completed her scan, and the results showed that he was most likely the leader of the group, not an incompetent boss or anything else. The dog realized that this stranger was not such an important person, but she was still angry with her because they told her one thing and she did the opposite. The group's leader kept yelling at the little girl for blindly relying on the prince's kindness, for not knowing the rules, and for being rude. She only smiled, knowing she was just a pet. But suddenly, behind the mustachioed man, the girl noticed someone who was heading straight towards them. Because of this, she frantically began to ask the dissatisfied gentleman to stop swearing at her. Suddenly, His Highness's voice came from behind the stranger, asking what was going on. He turned around in surprise. The mustachioed man cried out in fear when he saw the prince himself in front of him, and the protagonist smiled because she was able to stop him in time. Remembering this, Felix grabbed his head, angry that he dragged Eugene to class and left her for a while, but she managed to get into trouble. The knight understands that if everyone heard what happened to that nobleman, then it is unlikely that something like this will happen again, because the prince ordered to get rid of him. The point is that after that incident, rumors began to spread among the nobles that they should be wary of the slave girl. The guard realizes that this is not very good for Eugene. After this, the girl pretends that nothing happened, but he is sure that she is worried. And after these events, the pet ran away to the princess's palace without anyone's help. Felix wonders what would have happened if she had ended up in the emperor's palace by mistake. He would certainly have ordered her beheaded. The young man, fearing such an outcome, became convinced that it was indeed dangerous for the little girl to be outside the castle. The knight took on the prince's overprotectiveness. The man, completely confident in himself, heroically raised his hands, deciding that it was too dangerous. The main character, staying in the princess's palace, happily plays with Kun in the garden. She caught the tiger cub in her arms and fell to the ground. With him, Eugene joyfully told the kitten that he had grown a lot, become heavy and strong. Raphaela, who was drinking tea at the table next to the girl, told the girl affectionately that her mood seemed to have improved. The child asked Her Highness how she knew, and she replied that everything would become clear by looking at her expressions. Doggy first said that it was because she had hugged the tiger cub, but then she came to her senses and corrected herself, saying that she had only imagined that Kun was her friend. The surprised princess asked the little girl not to talk nonsense because no one would refuse to be friends with a kitty like her. Eugene smiled sheepishly, thinking how kind the lady was. Raphaela asked the blonde to tell her more about what had happened. In a few minutes, the heroine told the girl what had happened to her and that she had come to her after Felix saw that she was sad. But Her Highness suddenly asked in a stern voice who dared to offend her cat. Saying that this night was simply unbearable, the lady squeezed the handle of her teacup so hard that it became cracked. Noticing this, the protagonist smiled shyly and shuddered in fear. But then the princess suddenly tells the little lady that she wants to behead her god. Eugene was taken aback and asked the lady what she was even talking about. But Raphaela laughed and told the girl that she was only joking, and although the imperial law was harsh, she could not behead a man so easily. The lady asked her pet how about sending him to a place from where he would not be able to return, and she, thinking that this was another of her jokes, asked if it wouldn't be better to send him into space. The prince's sister said that they had already had one man who wanted to reach space with gunpowder, but he exploded before reaching the stars. The princess placed the cup of tea on the saucer, thinking that she hoped that Eugene understood that if this was what she wanted, then they would send the man flying. It doesn't matter to a young lady where she is, be it a hot desert, a monster's lair, or an icy wall of death. But then Her Highness's attention was drawn to a girl's question. She asked if she had seen the blue sea flowers that were mentioned in the book, The Song of the Blue Sea. Raphaela asked the little girl if she liked the color blue, and she replied that she did and that she liked sea flowers and water in general. The heroine closed her eyes, thinking how much she wanted to swim in the water, and when she worked in an office in her past life, she often went to the pool. But then the princess rose from her chair and told her young companion that she would take her there. She asked, puzzled, where. The girl simply looked at the kitty with a smile and extended her hand to her. Raphaela, having come to her brother's office with her little friend, asked him if the road to the lake was finished yet. The prince looked sternly at his sister and asked why she needed to know this. The lady said that the emperor had ordered an artificial lake to be created for his mistress, but because of her objections, a road to the lake near the palace was built instead, and they wanted to get there. The pet happily asked if they could really get there, to which the princess said that if she waited a little, she would send a carriage for you. Suddenly, as soon as the girl exclaimed how wonderful it was, His Highness furiously squeezed the pen in his hand so much so that it almost cracked. The man is trembling with anger that he was the one who was in charge of the project, of the road that irritates him, but for some reason, Eugene thanks Raphaela and not him. The princess asked the little girl what she would like to do at the lake, and she said that she would really like to swim. The lady agreed, but asked the child to say in advance what she wanted, thinking that they usually went boating or had picnics. But suddenly, Michael, shielding his dog with his body, said that nothing was needed and he himself would take care of his pet. The girl irritably asked her brother if he was trying to ruin her plan now. The young heir replied that he was merely preventing dirty hands from setting their sights on what belonged to others. A tense silence fell between the people, and the protagonist hid fearfully behind the owner's back. But then the prince turned to the child and, holding out his hand to her, invited her to follow him. Eugene put her hand down with a smile and followed after the master. The pouting princess, watching the departing couple, said that she would still have a look to see whose hands were clean. The main character, following the prince, blushed because now she felt real relief. Continuing to hold hands with the gentleman, the lady thinks that the reason she was previously disappointed in Felix is because she was accustomed to the peaceful life created by the owner of this hand. Eugene had already thought that she had lost faith in humanity as she saw how much filth there could be in society. But after becoming a dog, she regained this faith. Looking at the prince, the little girl wondered if she really had the essence of a pet. But then she smiled because she decided that these were different things because they were a dog and an owner. The protagonist knows that people betray each other all the time, but dogs don't do that, and so the owner won't abandon his pet. Suddenly, sometime later, Eugene was stunned by the unexpected news. She asked Michael, frightened, what he meant. He calmly repeated that now the shackles attached to her neck needed to be removed. The girl's trembling hand grasped the silver medallion. The child was terrified that for some reason they wanted to free her from her shackles. A memory from the original game comes to the little girl's mind, where Michael, holding Candace's collar in his hand, smiles and asks if she is happy. The girl with ears and a tail angrily replied to the man that she was happy until she saw him again. The gentleman grinned and, handing the maid the collar, asked why she left without putting it on, since that was not allowed. It was a sign that she belonged to him. Bending down to the beast girl, Michael said that he could not scold her, however, because she was too beautiful. Having put shackles around the pet's neck, the man added that she had done nothing wrong, she had simply chosen the wrong path. Countess began to be consumed by fear when His Highness suggested that someone useless had confused her, and therefore those who had led her astray needed to be punished. The room's doors swung open, and in the hallway, the girl saw the servants arrested by the knights. The prince told his pet that they had been sitting idle while she was gone. The maid was terrified by this, but the young master leaned towards her ear and said, with a smile, that they should all be punished for inaction. Candace called out to Michael in fear and frantically began to explain that she had simply made a mistake. The beast girl trembled with fear and began to cry, and His Highness smiled, because his name was now on the lips of his pet. But the master added that he couldn't leave such useless people near her. After this phrase, the slave saw scarlet splashes of blood. Through this memory, Eugene knows that the owner was possessed, and these shackles are a symbol of this as well as a sign of ownership. That's why the girl was horrified when Michael asked her to take off her collar, thinking that he no longer needed her. The prince is distracted by something, and the little girl can't stop worrying. She doesn't understand why this is happening, whether it's because she's not the main character or because it happens before the main story. But then the young gentleman, handing the child a small medallion with a white stone, asked him to take it instead of a collar. The young man explained that it was his sign and she wouldn't have to work. She just had to wear it so it was visible. The main character realized that she can now go from being a slave to becoming a servant. But she worries about whether the plot will change and whether they will get rid of her in the future. Michael wanted to touch the pet's shackles to remove them, but she angrily pulled his hand away, shouting that she didn't want to. His Highness's hand hung in the air and he stared at his pet in surprise. The prince tries to tell the child that he just wants a new collar, but the girl repeats that she doesn't want a new one and that she wants to be his doggy. Tears welled up in Eugene's eyes as she shouted to remind the prince that he brought her here himself, so he must take responsibility for her. Blondie lowered her head, thinking how he could do this to her when she had just admitted that she felt safe around him. Suddenly, the main character felt that the owner, having lightly embraced her, pressed her to himself. Michael, stroking his pet on the head, says that he understands her and asks her not to worry because he will do as she wants. The girl did not answer her master, but only cried, clinging to his chest. The master, without letting go of the girl from his embrace, does not understand what is so special about moving from a slave to a servant. The man smiled and hugged the girl tighter, mentally, repeating that Eugene was a puppy that belonged to him. Michael closed his eyes, thinking how stupid his dog was, because she didn't know any danger when she was in his arms. After some time, the prince, busy with work, gives the medallion to the butler and says that he no longer needs it. The servant bowed his head and took the jewel. The man was pleased to see His Highness in a good mood. The young gentleman thought about the fact that the dog did not want to take off the necklace, and he needed to make sure that no bad nobles appeared near her. The prince remembered how persistently the girl told him that she would never leave this place and that she did not want to become a servant. Suddenly, a sly smile appeared on the man's face as an interesting thought occurred to him. The next day, the king's son listens to the Lord's report. As he ordered, they are fighting the famine in the province of Tiraha. Michael said this was good and that they should use the budget wisely. But as soon as the prince told the man that he seemed interested in his pet, he suddenly replied excitedly that this was not the case at all. The Lord immediately bowed his head because he decided that this would be the end for him, since the butler had lost his hand, because he dared to contradict the Lord's dog. But Michael, calmly examining the documents in his hands, said that this girl would continue to live in the chambers next to his. A deathly silence fell over the hall as everyone, including the nobleman, thought that His Highness had a grudge against him for which he would pay. The heir, looking at the Lord with a smile, thinks that he told them the truth, and he wonders how they will perceive it. The young man thinks that the girl has settled in perfectly there, and although she is not a princess, as long as she likes it, there he is not going to change anything. Here the prince thought about something he had never thought about before, as he was busy with his father's errands. What his pet would look like in the role of a real princess? The officials, having left Michael's office, began to discuss among themselves how some slave could remain to live in the princess's quarters. The gentlemen all decided at once that this news should be told to everyone as quickly as possible, and that it would soon fly around the world. Finally, the princess, as promised, arranged a picnic for the kitten and her owner on the shore of the lake. There were 3 knights next to them, including Felix, who ensured the safety of the vacationers. The table was decorated with delicious cakes, cupcakes, strawberry pudding, and cookies. Raphaela asked the little girl if she liked desserts, and she replied admiringly that their taste was simply incredible. The lady said that they were prepared by one of her best pastry chefs, and if she came to visit her, she could eat as many of them as she wanted. The prince, frowning, said that there was enough food in his palace, so she had nothing to worry about. The sister asked with a smile if the kitten liked her desserts better, and if he would lock up the girl who so wanted to visit her palace. Michael's hand trembled, and he irritably replied that this was nonsense. Eugene, who was sitting next to him, cried out joyfully and rose to her feet. His Majesty, watching the pet, thinks that this is truly stupid. The child cheerfully pointed out the beautiful waves to her friends, and the young gentleman was struck by the thought of how beautiful his little girl looked in the warm sun. He didn't want to deprive her of this pleasure. Eugene, taking a basket with her, went to the shore to feed the swans with bread. At this time, Kun, who was sleeping nearby, suddenly opened his eyes because something really interested him. Seeing the happy girl feeding the birds, it occurred to the tiger that she was his friend and the swans were very beautiful toys. Excited by the opportunity to play with the birds, the cat jumped to his paws and rushed towards them. Raphaela, noticing her pet's excitement, loudly shouted the command, "No!" But the tiger cub didn't hear her. He jumped at the child, who turned around, confused by what was happening. Kun's unexpected attack caused the main character to fall straight into the water, creating a large, noisy splash. Amidst the streams of water and frightened birds flying in all directions, the girl replaced her master on the shore, who excitedly called out to her. Forgetting everything around her for a moment, Eugene was surprised that Michael had just called her by her name for the first time. The princess, seeing that something bad had happened to the kitten, suddenly froze in a daze, thinking that now perhaps her chance had come. But the girl was suddenly overcome with confusion, so she remained standing. Instead, her brother ran to the unfortunate woman's aid. Without any hesitation, the prince dived into the water after his girl, who had already managed to sink deep under the water. The man swam up to the dog, who was trying with all his might to hold her breath as long as possible, and grabbed her with his hands. Very quickly, the young master emerged into the air holding Eugene in his arms. The knights rushed to His Highness's aid, but Felix hesitated and remained in place. The guard thought what an idiot he was. He stood there and did nothing until the prince ran into the water. The protagonist, soaking wet, tried to cough, and Michael, who also had not a single dry spot left on him, told her that everything was fine and that she just needed to breathe through her nose. Tears came to the girl's eyes from fear, and because she fell so unexpectedly, she couldn't remember how to swim at all. Suddenly, the blonde looked up at her owner and saw him looking at her with an intent, unperturbed gaze while drops of water flowed down his face. The gentleman shouted at the knights, asking why they were standing there doing nothing, then ordered them to immediately bring him a towel and hot tea. As soon as His Highness came out of the water with the injured woman in his arms, Kun became attached to him and began meowing, asking them to play with him. But in response, the little animal only saw the prince glance at him with a look full of anger and discontent. The tiger cub was so frightened by this expression that he hid behind the back of his mistress, who was ordering the servants to find new dry clothes for the girl. Raphaela watched as Eugene, wrapped in a blanket, walked with a servant to the carriage where her appearance would be tidied up. The girl thought that she had missed her precious chance, which she had been so close to. If only she had run then. The maid drying the girl's wet hair with a towel is amazed at how scared she was when she jumped into the water. Another maid remarked that Kun probably did too, and that the princess should have kept a closer eye on her pet. The little girl smiled and said that everything was fine since the tiger cub was still very small. The servants laughed at the word doggy and reminded her that she was still a child too. Eugene thought that although she looked young in reality, the age difference between her and the prince was not that big. Remembering her master, the girl couldn't help but wonder how strong his arms and grip were. He was stronger than she expected. Suddenly, the heroine covered her face with a pillow, deciding she'd simply swallowed too much water, which was why she was having these thoughts. The worried maids couldn't figure out what was going on. While the kitten was being changed into new clothes, the princess silently observed the beautiful landscape, the clear blue sky and the dazzling waves. But then her brother appeared behind her and sternly told her that she needed to train her cat better so that he couldn't harm the other puppies. The lady stroked her tiger and said he had a name, Kun. He said he didn't care, but the princess added that the girl's name was Eugene. The prince fell silent with such surprise in his eyes as if his sister's words had made him think. But a moment later he raised an eyebrow in confusion and asked what she meant by that. Suddenly, a servant announced to the masters that Eugene had changed her clothes. The girl returned to her friends in an elegant beige dress. Raphaela hurried to her and asked if she was feeling well. Her Highness gently took the cutie's cheeks and asked if Kun had scratched her, and she replied that she had not. Michael, having watched his sister and the dog, decided to turn around and go about his business, which drew Eugene's attention. Suddenly the little girl called out loudly to her owner, which made the prince flinch and freeze with his back to the child. The man decided to remain motionless and not turn around, because he thought that she would be scared if she met his gaze. Suddenly the heroine, having run a couple of steps, appeared before the gentleman's eyes. Looking His Highness straight in the eyes, the girl blushed. She asked him to wait a little as she had something she wanted to tell him. The young man, without saying a word, prepared to listen to his pet, only mentally noting what beautiful puppy eyes she had. The gentleman thought that maybe that was the whole point. Eugene's eyes were like a lake into which you wanted to jump without thinking. Michael realizes he's the prince, yet he jumped into the water himself instead of the knights. Moreover, she certainly wouldn't have drowned, given the presence of the boat, but his feet carried him toward her before he could come to his senses. The man had always disdained efficiency. He recalls that when he caught the girl in the water, his hands trembled from her warmth, and he doesn't understand why. The protagonist at this time, with her hands hidden behind her back and her gaze embarrassed, wants to say something to the owner but is too shy. But suddenly, instead of any words, the little girl simply rushed into the prince's arms. Pressing herself against the young heir's chest, she thanked him with a blush on her cheeks for rushing to her aid. Michael froze for a few moments, staring at the girl with her lips parted. But suddenly, the gentleman's heart began to beat faster, and he suddenly realized that for reasons unknown to him, it was becoming difficult for him to breathe. The gentleman's ears turned red. He covered his mouth with his hand in surprise and embarrassment, because even after being immersed in water, his breathing hadn't faltered, and now, yes. Meanwhile, the main character continued to enjoy hugging the prince, thinking that, as she expected, he was a reliable person. But suddenly she opened her eyes because she caught herself doing something. Realizing this, the little girl moved away from her uncle and lowered her gaze, trying not to look outrageous. Eugene blushed with embarrassment, but in her mind, She began to justify herself, saying that she was just trying to act like a pet because the only way they express gratitude is through affection. The prince, lowering his palm, was also surprised by the fact that she pulled away from him first, and by the fact that she had never hugged him before, only occasionally approaching. Suddenly, the pet, looking into the master's face, became even more embarrassed than before because she saw his smile. Trying to cover her flushed face, she modestly asked the man why he was laughing. His Highness, touching the girl's hair, said that this was a natural reaction, and it was not surprising that he saved her because she belonged to him. The young man's palm stroked the little girl's cheek, and it made her look like a tomato. Suddenly, the heroine shouted that she urgently needed to return to the carriage and ran towards it. Having closed the door to the cabin and sat down on the sofa, she breathed a sigh of relief and, wanting to calm herself, thought that it was just an accident. Pressing her palms to her chest, the blonde suddenly wondered if that was really the case, because maybe he was just surprised by her expression. Yujin remembers that she often played the golden cage, but she had never seen the prince like this. Soon the stars descended upon the kingdom, and the windows of the luxurious palace lit up. The protagonist entered her room as usual, but was met by Felix, who bowed his head and said that he had gone too far last time. The girl, not expecting an unexpected apology from the man, asked him again in surprise. He repeated that he had made a mistake, or rather had failed in his task, for which he apologized. The knight wondered why it was so difficult for him to say that. The guard suddenly realized that if the little one had made a mistake, he would have behaved completely differently. Felix decided to face the truth. Even though Yujin was small, she was trying. He thought she was some kind of selfish cat, but in reality she cared about everyone in the world. The young man doesn't want to give up his training because of the escort, so he has to find time to train with Hartin. During the process, he sometimes told the dog about everything that was happening inside. The girl did not understand why Felix was so popular empty, and admitted that he was sweet and often joked about the compliments directed at him. But the guard, scratching his nose, realized she was his friend after all. The lady tried to take care of everyone, so he should try to open up to her. Finally, the knight said the right words. After apologizing, he admitted that he had been rude to her because of a situation that did not happen. The heroine was slightly embarrassed, but without losing her pride. She said that if he said so, then she would probably agree. The warrior did not expect such an impudent response to his apology, so an awkward silence fell between them. The doggy, smiling shyly, offered her friend some tea, to which he agreed, saying that he really loved herbal tea. After having tea, the heroine thought he was still awkward, but that would change with time. Spending every day with Felix, they finally became closer. The next day, the prince, as on other working days, was busy with business in his office. But then he glanced at his pet. The girl, swinging her legs, was reading a book lying nearby on the sofa. The gentleman was surprised that she could lie there for hours doing nothing. Suddenly, the heroine, as if feeling the master's gaze on her, turned in his direction, but he immediately lowered his head as if nothing had happened. The protagonist, looking sadly at Michael, thinks that she imagined that he was looking at her. Here, Yujin thought she wanted to thank him somehow, and when he didn't move as if his legs were numb, the little girl realized this wasn't a good sign. Having decided that this was unacceptable for his young body and that his health must be protected, she rose from the sofa and headed towards the prince. The girl, standing right in front of him, resolutely asked him to go for a walk with her. The butler and the guards who were standing near the young gentleman were completely shocked that the little one was forcing him to do something. Soon the main character was happily walking towards her favorite seating area in the garden, followed by his highness. The girl sat down on the swing, and Michael looked around to find somewhere to sit. Finally, the man decided to sit down on the stone bench directly in front of the swing. The young lady asked the gentleman why he worked so much, and he replied that such were the duties of a prince. Then the little girl asked in surprise why he worked so much, and Michael said that this was the custom of the emperor's heir. Yujin frowned and thought that in this world, the concept of child labor seemed to be non-existent, and if young people grew up with it, they would always be exploited. Suddenly, His Highness's eyes widened when the little dog asked what was included in this. The heroine angrily shouted at the owner that he was working as if he were the only one dealing with state affairs, and as if without him everything would fall apart. The pet added that she was dissatisfied with the emperor, because he shifted his responsibilities onto his son, which is why he worked himself to the bone. Suddenly, the protagonist fell silent because she realized that she had allowed herself too much. The girl's head immediately began to spin, because she decided that her insolence would be the end of her, since she had just insulted the emperor. But then the young heir laughed velvetily, and the protagonist jumped up from the swing in surprise and froze. Michael couldn't stop laughing out loud. He found it amusing that Eugene was insulting the emperor in front of the prince for overburdening him. Having laughed his fill, the gentleman suddenly thought that he was perhaps glad that he had brought her that day. Looking seriously at the girl, he thought that, as for the insults, there would be no problems since he was the only one who heard it. The man watching the stunned dog thinks that she belongs to him and will always be next to him. The heroine, smiling warmly, thought that she saw how much he had to worry about because of the emperor, and since he was so cheerful they wouldn't scold her. The pet understands that its owner cares about it more than about the ruler or the country's security. It enjoys following him and he enjoys raising his doggy. Sometime later, the blonde came into the kitchen and, armed with an apron and a whisk, declared that she was obliged to thank the owner. But then she turned back and looked at Felix, adding that she would cook with a friend. He, alarmed by the girl's mood, apologized again. Having shown the palace's head chef her drawing on a notebook, the protagonist said that she wanted to make exactly this kind of cupcake. The pastry chef said she meant fairy cake, and he liked that too. Eugene was surprised that cupcakes were called fairy cakes here. Having poured some milk into the bowl, the dog began to carefully whisk it. Her arm quickly began to ache from fatigue, but when she glanced at Felix, it turned out that he was already cooling off since he had managed to froth the milk before her. This really angered the little girl and gave her the motivation to keep interfering, because she was slower than that hated jock Felix. After such hard work, the girl fell into a chair, breathing her last, but the cook said that now she needed to put the dough into a pastry bag. But the knight, as soon as he began this task, accidentally squeezed the bag, causing the dough to fly everywhere. When the man looked around, he saw that he had smeared his dough all over the child's face, which even embarrassed the pastry chef. Eugene angrily asked her friend if he thought he had gone too far, and he immediately apologized and said he would clean it up. Once the dough had been poured into the molds, the chef explained that it now needed to be put in the oven. Then the pastry chef invites the students to begin making the icing, and the slave, just smelling its sweet aroma, thought how delicious it was and that the baked goods would taste simply magnificent. But suddenly she came to her senses because she remembered that she was preparing sweets, not for herself but for the owner as a sign of gratitude. The girl thought that she hadn't often seen Michael snack on anything, but he probably liked sweets since they were always served in such quantities. The young lady, preoccupied with thoughts of how sweet it was that the prince loved, Sweets did not at all notice that she had added a whole mountain of sugar to the bowl. The heroine, realizing her mistake, asked the chef if she needed to redo everything, but he sheepishly said that everything was fine, and she could make it to her taste. Soon the cupcakes were baked, and the head chef, taking them out of the oven, said that now was the time to decorate them with icing. The protagonist carefully squeezed cream onto each pancake using a pastry bag. Finally, she had beautiful cupcakes decorated with strawberry cream, grated chocolate, and cute sprinkles. Arriving at the master's study door, she greatly surprised the butler standing there. He anxiously asked the little girl what she was carrying with her. She smilingly holding out a cart with prepared sweets in front of her, says that this is a gift for His Highness. The man was overcome with fear when he heard this, but he was even more stunned by the fact that the girl was essentially bringing him lumps of sugar. Bellabrishka asked if she could come in to see Michael, and he said yes. thinking anxiously that after 10 years of service, it was definitely time for him to leave. The young man was working as usual, but suddenly he heard the door to his office open and his dog cheerfully call out to him. The prince saw Eugene smiling happily, pushing a cart with food. But Michael was suddenly furious that the butler had allowed the girl to drag such a heavy cart by herself. He wondered what he was even doing there. However, the gentleman was distracted by the little girl's sudden cry. She told the owner that she had brought him gifts. The young lady blushed and added that this was her way of thanking him for saving her life, for jumping into the lake, and for taking care of her. In the end, the heroine summed up by thanking him for everything. Michael, glancing at the cakes, saw that the word "thank you" was spelled out syllable by syllable in chocolate. His Highness's ears turned red, and he, admiring the child's creation, said that he had already promised her that he would always protect her because she belonged to him. The protagonist, overcoming her embarrassment, wanted to say something else, but he thought that the problem was that she was his sweet and unpredictable. He wasn't surprised that he wanted to kidnap her every time. The prince decided that he had to hide Eugene somewhere in the heart of the palace, surrounded by the empire's most secret things. The pet, with flushed cheeks, asked her owner if he liked sweets, and said that she had made these cakes herself. The gentleman's gaze fell on the sweets, and he was convinced of his suspicions. He must keep his dog locked up. The thought that his girlfriend, thinking that he liked sweets, had prepared these desserts for him warmed the man's soul. The butler standing next to the heroine became alarmed by the gentleman's gaze on the treats. He was certain the prince didn't want to eat them. Deciding that his time had come, the servant carefully pushed the tray away, saying that he would take care of the gifts' safety and place them on the table. But the old man quickly realized that he had made a big mistake when the young heir abruptly grabbed his hand. His Highness glared at his subordinate and asked how he dared to do this now. Michael, surprised that the servant dared to reach for his girl's first gift, ordered him not to touch the desserts. The butler pulled away at that moment, sweating profusely from the fact that he had almost crossed the line. Having cleared up the misunderstanding that had arisen, the prince armed himself with a fork and tried a piece of cake. The main character watched, fascinated, as the owner tried her creation, wanting to see if he liked it. The butler thinks that he will need to brew black tea for the master as soon as Eugene leaves, because he does not like strong flavors, neither sweet nor saltier. But suddenly, Michael told his pet that she had done very well, which made the girl very happy and stunned the servant, who decided that he was lying. The subordinate sighed, thinking that the heir apparently loved his pet more than he had imagined. The man couldn't believe the prince was lying to her, but the butler had no idea that His Highness actually really enjoyed the cupcakes. He sincerely believes Eugene is a true hostess. After a while, only crumbs remained of the desserts. The old subordinate had no idea that feelings of love sometimes influence a person's habits. A new day dawned, and a luxurious carriage set out from the prince's palace. Eugene, sitting in her seat, thought her pancakes had turned out better the second time, because Raphaela had sent her servants to help her. The girl decided she owed her a favor, so she headed out to meet her. The little girl asked Hartin, who was sitting opposite her, if Her Highness would like her treats, and she said with a smile that she certainly would. Felix, who went with them, looked at his colleague in surprise when she told the child that the cupcakes he made were very tasty. The man asked the girl if she really liked his desserts so much, to which she, blushing, said yes. After this, the knight, with a smug smile, declared that he had real talent, because his cupcakes, which he had prepared for the first time, were so praised. The main character asked her friend not to be arrogant, but he, calling Eugene a brat, said that she was simply jealous of him. Felix asked Hartin, upset, if everything hadn't been perfect for him, to which the girl replied with a smile that everything had been fine. The security guard wanted to comfort her friend, so she stroked his head like a dog. Realizing that she had gone too far, The night girl apologized to the man, but he suddenly shouted in embarrassment that nothing terrible had happened. Felix leaned over to his friend and happily said that she could pet him some more, but she waved her hands shyly and refused. Eugene called Felix a fool because he was making Hartin uncomfortable, which angered the guard. The blonde also asked him not to call her little brat. The young man asked how he couldn't call a little girl a brat, to which the pet snorted irritably. Looking at her confused friend, the protagonist thought that he was still the little one. He couldn't figure out his feelings like a child. Soon the little dog's carriage arrived at the princess's palace, where the butler invited them inside. At the castle, the heroine was met by a maid, who bowing told her that the princess would come later when the reception of guests was over. The girl decided to go to a nearby room, while the maid called her guards to follow her. Entering the room, Eugene saw a table that was already filled with various delicious sweets. But the baby decided to ignore it because she had just eaten, and in order to eat more, she first needed to empty her stomach. The young lady continued to look around the room when she suddenly noticed a very beautiful object on the nightstand. Blondie assumed it was perfume. The pet wanted to smell their aroma, so she opened the bottle, from which an enticing scent immediately came out. The aroma captivated the girl like hypnosis, and she immediately felt a strong thirst without even noticing how she brought the fragrant substance to her lips. But as soon as the main character took a few sips, she immediately felt the effects of magic. After some time, Raphaela burst into the room and cheerfully exclaimed to the kitten that she had already arrived. But the girl suddenly froze in surprise because she heard nothing in response, and moreover, she saw no one in the room. Worried about where her little friend might have gone, the lady began looking for her in the middle of the room when she suddenly noticed an open jar on the floor. While searching for any other clues, His Highness heard a pix out of the corner of her ear, a quiet, high voice desperately calling her. As soon as Raphaela turned around at the sound, she saw Eugene on the nightstand, shrunk to the size of a matchbox. Thumbelina, with her white hair, was waving her arms and calling out to her friend. The rider leaned over to the little girl and in disbelief asked if it was her. The protagonist, upset with grief, asked how. The princess, covering her mouth with her hand in admiration, thought that the shrinking potion she had made had worked just fine. She also thought, although she admitted it was inappropriate, how cute and small Eugene was, like a fairy. The girl extended her hand to the child and suggested that she move it somewhere first, since it would probably be difficult for her to stand on the stand. Raphaela lowered her fingers to the pet, and it carefully climbed onto them. The lady with the kitten in her arms walked around the room, which the main character did not quite like. The little girl suddenly felt a chilling fear because she was about to fall. The princess's ordinary steps seemed like a real earthquake to Thumbelina, and she fell sharply on her back in her palm. Noticing this, His Highness fearfully asked the little one if everything was okay with her. She, trembling with fear, only grabbed the lady's finger tightly, thinking that she almost fell as if from a skyscraper. But Raphaela suddenly felt touched by the girl, although she admitted that now was not quite appropriate to think about such things. The girl transferred the crumbs to the cake, namely to its soft layer, onto which the heroine carefully stepped. Eugene was very surprised by the softness under her feet and kicked it several times, while His Highness offered to explain to her what she had drunk. She explained that it was a potion she had created, based on one from her book, although she didn't include it in the plot because she thought it was too weird. The lady admitted that it was her mistake and she needed to remove it before she arrived. The little girl waved her hands and said that everything was wrong and that it was all her fault because she drank it without even thinking about it. But the princess pointed her finger at the kitten and objected that she was not to blame for this, either because it had been specially enchanted. The protagonist remembered that as soon as she opened the jar, she really did want to drink it for no reason, as if it was asking her to do so. Raphaela told her friend that she was vulnerable in her current state, so it would be best for her to remain at her palace. Then the lady said she would return soon. Thumbelina, with white hair, asked how long it would take for her to grow back, and she explained that she just needed to brew the right potion. Then the young heiress told the girl that she would use magic to make her stronger, so that she could easily lift objects and speak loudly. Immediately after her words, the girl bewitched the main character with her charms. Thanks to this, Eugene found that her voice had indeed become louder, as if she was speaking into a megaphone, which made her very happy. Raphaela waved goodbye to her pet and said she'd go brew a potion. She shouted that she'd wait here for her knights for now. As soon as the princess left, the main character tiredly fell onto the cake, thinking about what an annoying situation had happened to her. But then the girl squeezed the soft top of the cake like snow, and a small lump came off from it. The little girl was so amused that she tore out dozens of these lumps, creating a hole under herself, into which she lay down with a smile. Suddenly the heroine looked to the side and saw a small hole in the wall of the cake. Thumbelina's eyes lit up with a new idea. She came up with a task for herself to get out of prison on her own, similar to Shawshank. Eugene began to poke around in the depths of the cake like a mouse digging a hole for itself. Having dug a tunnel for herself, the blonde finally got out of the cake and stepped onto the table. Looking around, the little girl saw a bunch of giant plates with giant desserts, which made her think with delight that she had ended up in the kingdom of sweets. Noticing a fork on its way that looked like a huge trident, the dog wondered if Alice felt the same way and whether she could pick it up. But the little one was able to pick up the device without much effort and stick a piece of cake on it, because she has the princess's spell, increasing strength. Having enjoyed one dessert, the heroine moved on to another. She happily snacked on strawberries, thinking that this was the biggest berry in her life. Then the girl decided she wanted chocolate pudding, so she boldly cut it in half with a fork. The protagonist was delighted, imagining herself as a chocolate killer, but did not notice something unusual. Raising her head, the dog saw that liquid chocolate filling was pouring out of the cake she was cutting right on her. Horror was frozen on the poor girl's face. Fearing that this liquid would flood her, she called out to her owner. At this moment, the prince's hand, which was habitually busy with documents, trembled. The man wondered what this strange feeling was that he felt, as if someone was calling him. Then the gentleman looked at the sofa, where his dog always sat, and remembered that she had not appeared that day. His Highness asked the butler how his day had gone, and he replied that if he meant the pet, then she had gone to visit the princess today. Michael wondered what this could mean, but decided to leave the girl alone because she clearly would not behave recklessly. But then Felix comes into the prince's office, introduces himself respectfully, and says that he has just arrived from the princess's palace. As soon as the knight said that Eugene would not be returning to the palace today due to an incident, the young master suddenly stood up. The man walked silently past the guard and butler, who were dumbfoundedly asking him what had happened. The old man asked the prince if he was heading to his sister's palace and if he had better prepare a carriage, to which he said that he did not have time. His Highness walked quickly out into the street, where he whistled for his horse. A few moments later, Michael's mare ran up to him, and the man nimbly jumped onto it, preparing to set off as quickly as possible. The prince, as if trying to contact Eugene through his mind, asked her to wait a little before he saved her. At this moment, the girl rushed away from the hot liquid which was about to flood her. Suddenly, the little girl saw the hands of the princess in front of her, who came to her aid. The little dog immediately ran towards her with all its might and fell right into Raphaela's palm. The girl looked closely at the baby and worriedly asked if she was okay. She just looked at it with tears in her eyes and thought that it was a miracle she managed to survive because she was almost drowned in chocolate. Her Highness asked the girl to stay away from desserts because she might drown in their fillings. But then the princess began to think that it wasn't just about desserts. The kitten could get drenched in hot tea if she accidentally knocked over the cup. Then the lady looked at the plate of jelly and realized that Eugene might get stuck in it and suffocate. The princess realized with horror that this table was simply dessert hell for her little friend. The lady looked at the blonde, who was trembling with fear, and realized that it was too dangerous for her here, and that a suitable place had to be found for her. But suddenly the girl had an idea that she decided to bring to life. The princess brought Yujin to her room, where she showed her a toy replica of her palace that she had been given as a child. The main character entered the palace through a small door and was surprised that it really was like a smaller version of it with a bunch of small details. Raphaela opened the roof of the house to look at Thumbelina from above and ask if everything was okay with her. The little girl replied that yes, and that she absolutely loved the palace. So the girl asked her friend to play there while she worked on the potion. The princess sat down at her desk, which was located very close to the mini palace, to prepare the necessary potion. When the required solution was ready, the girl simply had to snap her fingers for the magic in it to be activated. Yujin, looking out onto the balcony of the toy house, was delighted by this magic, but then apologized to her friend for distracting her. Her friend said it was nothing serious and that she should let the potion steep. The heroine nodded and told Raphaela that she had never seen her prepare magical liquids before, then asked if it was possible to learn magic. She, taking off her work glasses, said that for this you need to have the makings. Her Highness showed a small glass ball and said it could determine the purity and quantity of magic. She invited Yujin to test it. The dog placed both hands on the ball, which felt enormous to her. The princess explained that she should imagine giving up her energy. The girl tried her best to do as she was told, but nothing worked. Raphael advised her to concentrate on her palms. In the end, Yujin couldn't do anything and just dropped her hands tiredly. The princess, seeing the kitten's sadness, threw the ball out of her hands and exclaimed that there weren't many people in the world who had a predisposition for magic. The girl suggested that the little one take something else instead, when suddenly she noticed that the magic ball she threw began to emit light. But then the writer was distracted by something else. She heard the excited cries of a maid coming from the corridor. The servant tried to explain to the unexpected guest that she had to notify the princess first, but he ignored her and burst into his sister's office. Without even saying hello, the out-of-breath prince asked Raphaela where his pet was. She, crossing her arms over her chest, said angrily that he had arrived unannounced, then asked what was wrong, and the young heir went to her, asking her not to ask but to answer. The lady, silently looking away, simply pointed her finger at her little toy palace. After examining it, Michael spotted his doggy on the small balcony, looking more like a doll. She smiled sweetly and greeted him. His Highness felt very uneasy. He did not understand how Yujin could have shrunk to such a size. But despite his worries, the man thought how sweet his girl was. She had become even more charming. Her beauty knew no bounds. Raphaela pointed at the little one and asked her if she could come into her toy palace for a while, and she, feeling like a real dog in trouble, agreed. The girl asked her brother if he could leave now that he'd checked everything, but he asked how that had happened. The lady asked her brother not to be so threatening. It took Raphaela a few minutes to explain how Yujin had become so small. The prince considered the situation and told his sister that it was all her fault. The writer agreed, but added that since it was her mistake, she was going to correct it herself, which her brother did not argue with. Intending to take with him a miniature version of the palace in which the white-haired Thumbelina sits, Michael asked to send the potion to him when it is ready. The indignant princess asked the master to stop, and if he wanted to leave with Yujin. He asked what was so surprising about that. The girl asked the prince if he understood the danger his pet was in, being in such a small body, to which he said that he would look after her. But suddenly the man's eyes widened when Raphaela asked him what he thought would happen to her clothes when they returned to their previous sizes. Her Highness asked her brother with a smile if he wanted to watch this, to which the prince asked, confused, what she was carrying. Michael flinched when he heard the voice of the dog calling out to him from the toy palace. The little girl looked out of the small door and looked at her owner with big, uncomprehending eyes. As soon as the gentleman met the girl's gaze, his ears turned red with embarrassment. A moment later, the man strode toward the exit, announcing his departure. His sister, realizing he'd finally figured it out, waved goodbye. Michael asked the princess to contact him immediately as soon as the spell on the girl was lifted, as he would be going home with her on the way back. His Highness finally asked Raphaela not to repeat her mistakes. She waved at him with a smile, wishing him to leave them behind. When the prince finally left, the girl told Eugene that he had imagined God knows what, because she had not claimed that the clothes would not grow along with the body. The lady explained to her little friend that if her potion did not work, she could sleep in her bedroom that day, which made her very happy. The potion that the princess prepared was ready only by nightfall and began to work the next morning. As soon as the protagonist drank it and returned to her normal form, she was already in the carriage next to the owner in which she was riding home. But she noticed something unusual. The prince holding her hand asked if she was in pain. The little dog thinks that even though her body is no longer small, Michael's hands are still just as big. Besides, the young man is seriously worried about her health since he leaned so close to her to examine her carefully. Pet wondered if this was like an interrogation where Michael asks her as a criminal what happened last night, and she replies that nothing happened. Then the girl thought it was like a press conference. The owner asks how she is feeling, and she happily says that she is fine. Michael told the pet that when they arrived, he would call a wizard to examine her. She looked at the master and realized he was very worried. The carriage drove to the palace, and the heroine realized that a lot had happened in the last few days, so she would refrain from walking so as not to worry the prince. Arriving back at the palace, the protagonist returned to her favorite hobbies, lying on the bed reading magic books and eating sweets. Felix glanced at her and thought she seemed glued to the bed. He told the lady that the book she was reading was being turned into a play at the theatre. The girl was overjoyed when she heard that she would also have magical special effects. The pet thought that in order to go to the performance, she first needed to wash and get ready. But this did not stop her, and she jumped to her feet. But as soon as the main character was already sitting on the seat opposite the stage, a strange feeling came over her. It turns out she never went anywhere, and an impromptu theatre was prepared for her right in the middle of the palace. The ballroom, with its band playing music and colourful stage, turned into a real theatre for one spectator, little Eugene. The little girl, watching the performance with fascination and snacking on a cookie, thinks that you have to be a major player in the dog world to arrange something like this for your pet, and this is her owner. Ever since the blonde girl returned from the incident, magic books and whatever she wanted to eat were delivered straight to her room. The performance she so longed to see was staged for her right at the palace. The girl enjoyed the premiere the most. Several days passed, and the doggy, having dropped the cupcake on the floor, thought about what a happy and prosperous life she had had in captivity up until that moment. Looking at herself in the mirror, the protagonist was truly horrified by what she saw. She had gained weight. Eugene called out loudly to the knights, Felix and Hartin, who were standing not far from her. The little girl approached them and asked excitedly if anything had changed about her. The man asked what was wrong, and the girl replied that she was as sweet as ever. The pet thanked them, but her anxiety didn't subside. She couldn't believe they were saying that the lady thought they couldn't see beyond their swords. When she came to visit Raphaela, the girl asked her if she had gained weight, to which she replied that she was still as cute as a kitten. The little girl thanked him again for the compliment, but thought it was strange, as if those around her were too kind to her. Finally, the child visited the owner's office, where she asked him if she had gained weight. Michael stared at the dog in silence for a while, but then modestly said that he liked the way it looked. The master's answer completely confused Eugene. All the people in the palace, including the prince, were too kind to her. However, the main character thought that, although the fatter the pets, the cuter, but since this happened, it was necessary to check. The girl asked the owner where the scales were, and he asked her why she needed them, thinking that she wanted a new toy that she needed to buy. The young lady, having replied that she simply wanted to weigh herself, as she had gained a lot of weight, the prince sternly asked his pet who dared to tell her that. The protagonist was frightened by the sudden anger of the owner, who, jumping up from his chair, angrily asked what her security guards were doing. Felix and Hartin, who were standing nearby, obediently bowed their heads and admitted that they were very ashamed, and they could not believe that someone could insult Eugene like that. But suddenly, the little girl exclaimed that everything was completely different. She had come to this conclusion herself, and no one had told her this. Understanding the situation, His Highness calmly said that he liked her just the way she was, and the two guards said that she was very nice, as always. The protagonist smiled at her friends, but still wasn't entirely satisfied with their answer. Later, the dog found out that scales are only used in the kitchen, but people are not weighed like meat. The girl let out a sad sigh, wondering if she should deny that everyone thought she was cute. But still happily plopping down on the bed, she decided that she was beautiful, regardless of whether she was fat or not. Having decided that now that the problem was solved, she could lie down, but then thoughts returned to her about how heavy she was and how she had lost muscle mass. Bella Briska thought that she needed to increase her endurance and that the exercise would be good for her. Remembering that for a pet to live a healthy life, it needs to be walked, Eugene went for a walk. The child decided to spend time not alone but with Kun, but when the girl saw him after a long time, she became a little wary. Eugene knows that baby animals grow very quickly, but looking at the tiger who had grown so much in such a short time, she wondered if it was too much. The white beast roared menacingly and rushed at the little girl, which frightened her greatly. The main character ran away from the beast in fear, but closing her eyes, she did not notice how the tiger deftly jumped over her. After running a few steps, the animal stopped, sat down on the ground and looked back at the girl. Kun encouraged his friend with his eyes to run faster, and she, understanding this, continued to run, with all her might, telling the beast that she was already hurrying to him. Out of breath, Eugene walked to the tiger cub and thought that she would be bored walking alone, so she took her feline friend with her, but this was her mistake. The beast sat and waited for the doggy. Ever since they've been walking together, it's either a walk or a beating. Thanks to Kun, the heroine is active in terms of physical activity, but now she doesn't know how to get rid of him. As soon as the protagonist caught up with her furry friend, he immediately took off. The girl watched him silently, thinking that she was running easier today. Continuing to follow the tiger, she came to a lake. The pet reflected on how far she had come today than yesterday. After admiring the water's surface, the heroine remembered that Kun also liked swimming. Without thinking, the little dog called out loudly to the beast, and he, raising his head, saw the stick she had thrown in the air. The kitten ran for a stick and plopped right into the water. White-haired Cat praised the tiger, thinking that there was nothing better for refreshing oneself than a swim. The animal grabbed the stick in its mouth and brought it back to the girl, wanting her to throw it again. The main character decided to play with Kun again, and getting ready to throw a twig, ordered the animal to get ready. This went on for quite a long time. The blonde played with the tiger until she fell from exhaustion, asking him to let her rest for a little while. Suddenly, the tiger cub darted off to the side. The four-legged creature's unpredictable behavior confused the little lady. When the pet disappeared from the sight of the girl and her two guards, they suddenly heard a loud, frightened cry. Having run to the place from where the sound was heard, the protagonist began to call out to Kun, but behind her she heard the voice of a girl asking the beast to leave her. The girl turned around instantly, and seeing that the young lady was afraid of the predator, she sharply gave him the command, "No." The tiger cub complied, sitting down on the ground while she approached the frightened brunette and asked if everything was okay. She said she was scared of him. Eugene looked around and saw that there were servants next to the mistress, but for some reason they did not rush to help her. Some time later, the heroine and the rescued lady had a picnic. The latter admitted that the tiger had scared her and asked if it bit too, which the woman replied that it was tame, but she wasn't its owner. The brunette said that this was not true, because she was the one commanding him, but the blonde waved her hands and said that she was only walking with him, and Kun belonged to Raphaela. The girl admitted that she thought she would be eaten, for which the dog apologized to her and said that she thought there was no one else on the coast except them. She said that everything was fine and that children didn't need to know everything, to which Eugene smiled, thinking that the lady also looked like a child. Then the young lady asked her saviour, her name saying that her name was Annette, and in full Countess Annette Medeor. Hearing this, the heroine immediately recalled how she watched the master at work, and how the butlers informed him of more and more of Annette's wishes. Bellobriska immediately realized that in front of her was the Emperor's beloved, also known as Cetro Jinsen. The protagonist introduced herself casually, thinking that Annette was also a child, although she was supposedly 20 years old and did not look like the person in question. The Countess thoughtfully told her young interlocutor that her name seemed familiar to her. Cetro said she rarely goes outside, but decided to take a walk by the lake today. The little girl asked if she liked it, and she said yes. But suddenly the lady, her face flushed, objected that she wasn't so much as to force anyone to demolish the palace and build a path. The girl told the protagonist that if she knew about it, it was a myth. Annette added sheepishly that since Dietrich had decided to pave the way for her here, she decided to walk along it so that he wouldn't think that he was doing it in vain. Then the Emperor's beloved noticed Eugene's hair, and reaching out to touch her strands with her hand, said that they were quite unusual. But suddenly the lady sharply pulled her hand away, and the dog looked at her in bewilderment. The brunette asked the little girl not to think anything like that, and the heroine thought that Annette reminded her of her friend from high school. The Countess offered to braid her pet's hair, but the slave thought that the Countess was like a desperate child who did not want to be hated. Eugene remembers that the owner is a poor teenager who is constantly overloaded with work. She wants him to rest, but she needs to take a realistic view of the situation. The girl thought that she was an adult after all, so she wouldn't be rude to Cetro and would agree with her idea. Annette happily took up the task. While braiding the heroine's hair, she quietly hummed a melody. Soon the hairstyle was finished, and the girl invited the child to look at her reflection in the water. The child was very surprised to see a beautiful braid on herself. The Countess whispered to her friend if it was truly beautiful, then said she looked very much like Elsa. These words echoed in Eugene's mind. The girl was even more surprised when Cetro said pitifully that it would be ideal if she could use a curling iron. The blonde thoughtfully replied that this was so, to which the brunette said that she didn't have any, for which she apologized. A drop of sweat ran down the stunned heroine's face. She was sure that she had not misheard what Jinsen said about Elsa and the tongs which do not exist in this world. She suddenly wondered who Annette was if she knew about things that exist in the real world. The Emperor's beloved began to tell that there were also other hair tongs there in the form of a hot stick. The pet thought that perhaps she was also from Korea because she had black hair and eyes, and if so, then Annette might know something about Eugene. Suddenly, the brunette asked the little girl if she often came here, to which she frightenedly asked what she had said, since she was deep in thought and did not hear. The Countess sat closer to the girl and said she would like to see her, to which the blonde shyly replied that she rarely walked by the lake. The girl replied that they could see each other anywhere. The protagonist felt uneasy from the mistress's words, but when she gently took her hands to say goodbye, she became even more embarrassed. Annette smiled right into her little friend's face, waiting for her answer, which made her feel even more awkward. She finally managed to squeeze out that they would see each other again, which greatly pleased the girl. Eugene thought she should be patient since Cetro was the owner's stepmother. The next day, the main character curled up in bed with a book. Thinks that she was unlucky yesterday, so it's better to keep a low profile for a while. But suddenly, Felix's shout distracts her from reading the book. He angrily asks Hartin how she could not tell him about this. The pet looked at her guards and saw that the man was asking the guard why he was hearing such news from others. Suddenly, the girl seriously asked her partner why she should tell him that she was proposed to. Jin jumped out of bed in shock and asked her darling if she was really going to get married. But an enraged Felix asked the little girl what kind of nonsense this was and who this stupid, fat, narcissistic idiot could marry. Hartin, noticing her colleague's displeasure, feigned apology to him for making her an offer. The two knights exchanged angry glances, and the dog thought that the atmosphere had become somewhat heavier. The guard told her friend that she still needed to see the other knights and then left him. As soon as the door slammed, Felix muttered angrily that his girlfriend's fiancé was a complete fool who only had a title and status. The main character sitting on the bed was embarrassed, thinking that in essence any family is insignificant when compared to the emperor. The man angrily declared that the groom was not even good enough to be called an imperial knight, and that he looked like a shaggy pony. But the little girl said that this was not true, and not many people were lucky with their looks. Felix, in a fit of rage, wanted to add something else, but he fell silent in disappointment. His silence and sadness spoke for themselves. The pet looked at her friend in surprise, and noticed that his eyes were red. Some time later, after having tea with sweets, the heroine, after a conversation with the knight, concluded that the descendant of a noble family had proposed to Hartin. Felix grumbled that the groom was not a descendant of such a noble family, to which Jin told her friend that he just thought so. Beloriska looked away, thinking that this looked very much like a marriage contract. The marriage of Hartin, a commoner who has achieved rank but not recognition in aristocratic society, and a family that needs a connection to the palace. The security guard irritably asked his friend if she knew that his future bride had been ugly as a child, and shorter than him even in heels. But as soon as the little girl asked Felix if he had feelings for Hartin, he immediately blushed and asked in fear what she was talking about. The boy sheepishly asked the little girl not to say such a thing, since she was not noticing what she wanted, but the girl already knew that her guesses were correct. Belobriska asked her friend if he needed help with love, to which the man turned away mockingly and asked why. However, coughing delicately, Felix asked what kind of help she wanted to offer him. But then Jin disappointedly asked her friend to stop this, because it seemed as if Hartin had done something bad. The knight, thinking that she meant that there was something wrong with him, began to prove how cute he was, but the little girl covered her ears with her hands. The dog thought that she still didn't want to give Felix any hope, although she had noticed more than once how Hartin looked at him with interest. Some time later, the pet sipping tea by the window asked Hartin what vacation she was talking about. She said she needed it for personal reasons. The girl apologized to the child for having just returned from a trip and already being off somewhere. The little girl said that she understood everything, after which the girl knight hurried away, but Felix watched her with a close gaze. When his friend left, a slight blush appeared on the man's saddened face. Several days passed, and the main character, who was reading a book on the bed, asked the security guard in surprise if he was also going on vacation. He said with a smile that it was so, after which he introduced the dog to her new guard, for the time that he and Hartin would be absent. Still, the blonde allowed Felix to leave, although she herself could not keep her mouth closed from shock. The protagonist slammed the book down angrily, thinking that the two were behaving as they pleased. Having imagined Felix and Hartin as a couple in love, the little lady realized that this was precisely why the three of them couldn't be friends. She was now completely alone. The main character wondered whether it would be like this on a permanent basis if they got married. Suddenly, the girl realized that she felt terribly awkward around the unfamiliar guard, so she decided to return to her owner. However, when she entered his office, she saw that there was complete silence and no one was there. Upset that even Michael wasn't there with her, Jin plopped down on the sofa. But then the little girl realized that she had been too tired in recent days, which is why she quickly fell asleep. Suddenly, the protagonist wakes up, but not in her own body, but in the body of a certain black-haired girl from the real world whose face is stained with blood. When she came to, she realized with horror that she was lying on the asphalt between two people while they were crushed by an overturned car. A foul, strange, fishy smell touched Eugene's nose, making her dizzy. Suddenly, the blood-stained woman lying to the girl's right came to. The heroine recognized her as her mother. The protagonist called out loudly to her mother and tried to move her hand, but couldn't. Unsure why her fingers were so wet, she had no idea they were covered in blood. The woman touched her daughter's face with her trembling hand and told her that she was still very young and should be close. Tears welled up in Eugene's eyes as she asked her mother to wait a little while for the rescuers to arrive, insisting that their government employees worked quickly. At the same time, the protagonist ordered herself to come to her senses. After trying to move her shoulder, she realized she couldn't move her arms or legs. Suddenly, the girl's father, lying to her left, spoke to her. Coughing up blood, he asked the child for forgiveness. She asked him not to worry so much. The father, overcoming the pain in his whole body, tells his princess that she was incredibly beautiful when he first held her in his arms. The man confessed to his daughter that he would very much like to make her happy for the rest of her life, but he was unable to protect her, for which he asked her forgiveness. Tears streamed down Eugene's cheeks, but she asked with a smile what he was talking about, since she would always be there for her parents. Black clouds gathered over the heads of the unfortunate, and the protagonist's mother and father spoke their last words. The man and woman's bodies went limp, signaling their time was up. The girl caught between them burst into bitter tears. But then the main character, finding the strength to smile, asked her mom and dad not to worry because she promised them that she would live a good life. The daughter's smile widened, causing tears to stream down her eyelashes. She once again asked her parents not to worry and to rest in peace. The protagonist woke up from sleep in the same body of a white-haired little girl. She rose from the sofa and looked at the prince's desk and saw that he still had not appeared there. Eugene walked to the window and put her hand on it, thinking that she had not kept her promise. The little girl recalls that for some time it was difficult for her to stay at home after the death of her parents. At first she was shaking from all this, but then she just cried quietly over the memories. Later, the girl stopped crying, but what she never got used to was the eternal emptiness. In her past life, Eugene often stayed late at work to avoid sitting at home alone. After sunset, her house became as dark as the world around her. The darkness, too, hadn't become a habit for her. The child fell to the floor exhausted, realizing that she hated all of this terribly. Suddenly, someone's hand gently took her cheek and lifted her face up. It turned out to be Michael, who, looking into the dog's eyes, said that he knew she had been crying and then asked what had happened. But Eugene instead howled loudly and burst into tears, tears streaming from her eyes. His Highness was quite taken aback by this, and the girl, still crying, rushed into his arms. The man stroked his pet's hair and assured the little girl that everything was fine. While calming the girl, Michael thought about how he knew that her heart was heavy now, but he didn't understand what he should do without letting go of the doggy. From his arms, he decided that he would do everything so that she would not cry anymore, because he sincerely wanted to calm her down and lift her spirits. The girl buried her face in her master's chest, unable to hold back her tears, and His Highness, tenderly calling out to the girl, said that everything was fine. Suddenly, the little girl noticed that the gentleman had just called her by name. She reflected on the fact that she chose the role of the main character because she wanted to, and now it is clear to her that she has become obsessed with the prince. But before the blonde realized this, she had already gotten too close to him and now wants to return to him constantly. The heroine raised her head to look at her master's face. Seeing his smile, the blonde realized he had now become her home. The protagonist doesn't even remember when it started. There was no particular impetus. After the accident, she ran from her problems, neglecting herself. At that time, Eugene felt like if she stopped even for a second, she would immediately fall apart. But here, when the girl felt alone, a kind man's hand stroked her hair, reminding her of what she had lost. When she was tormented by nightmares, Michael's voice whispered to her and pulled her out of the terrible dream. And when the little girl did not want to be alone, she returned to the palace, the setting sun shining on her back. At times like these, she was always amazed that the prince would deliberately finish his work early and then wait for her to arrive. For the first time since she'd said goodbye to her family, someone was waiting for her. The owner is like a ray of sunshine for the heroine. Small, warm, yet dazzlingly bright. He has become her home. Still comforted in His Highness's embrace, the girl thought about how warm she felt. Eugene finally realized that she could tell her mum and dad the truth. She was okay. She was okay. Although her parents certainly didn't expect her to call a doghouse, her home, the doghouse she lives in, is the most luxurious in the world. Several days passed. The protagonist, surrounded by soft pillows, sank into a slumber in her favorite gazebo. But suddenly, she woke up from someone joyfully calling out to her and screaming like, "Finally, I found you." When the little girl got up, she saw a smiling Annette next to her who asked her if she had slept well. The lady immediately sat down close to the child and told her that she had promised to visit her more often. The girl thought unintentionally that she hadn't expected to see her here. The countess began to incessantly ask her tired friend to give her a new hairstyle, to which the young lady resigned herself, thinking that there was nothing she could do. Bellobriska did not like this meeting, so she decided to hide in the princess's palace the next day, hoping that she would not find her there. Having done so, the main character spent time with Kun scratching his belly as if nothing had happened. But then Annette suddenly appears, cheerfully greeting the doggy. The little girl, taken aback, accidentally squeezed the tiger's tail in her hand. Eugene felt very embarrassed in front of the cat and apologized. Jinsen, looking at the animal, asked if it was the same tiger. The brunette immediately led her friend to the gazebo, inviting her to sit there for a while. The pet wondered how she'd even gotten to the princess's palace. As soon as the girls sat down at the table, Annette, with the brightest smile, asked the child how she was doing. Without waiting for an answer, the girl began chatting incessantly about all sorts of things related to hairstyles, while Eugene, who was not interested in this, simply yawned. The next day, Princess Raphaela was surprised that the Emperor's beloved came to her again. She looked at her guiltily and agreed, after which she asked for forgiveness. After a few moments of awkward silence, the Countess rose from the sofa and told her mistress that she was probably busy, so she should leave her alone and go see what was happening in the garden. Raphaela watched silently as the brunette hurriedly left her room. The princess grabbed her head because she knew that Annette was actually going not to the garden but to Eugene, and she did not understand why she kept coming to her. Very soon, the Emperor's beloved found her little friend, whom she greeted warmly. She also greeted her, though reluctantly. After that, the Countess, seeing that the girl's hair was unbraided, offered to braid it again. Cetro began to braid the heroine's hair while telling her about what happened to her and Dietrich today, although she did not want to gossip about the ruler. But then Annette, looking into the doggy's face, smiled. She realized that she really liked Eugene. The girl had never seen a stranger whose eyes sparkled when he said his name. The Countess believed it was because she was still young. Annette Medeor recalls that her name and identity changed forever when she arrived in this world. In her past life in Korea, she was a beauty school student and had good potential. But one day, everything changed when she decided to follow a cat into a dark alley. After that, she found herself in another world, where she met a handsome stranger, Dietrich. Her head became clear around this man, and when he looked at her, his face relaxed. At first, Annette thought that she had become a character in some novel where she plays the role of a rich woman who is looked after by her servants. She found herself in a life where she was given everything she desired, where a handsome man loved her. It all seemed like a dream to Meteor, but everything ends someday. One day, a banquet was being held in the Emperor's palace, where the noble guests, looking at Cetro, the Emperor's physician, gossiped about what she was treating, since the king was unwavering even in battle. The woman told Duke Jorvon that it was all nonsense and that he shouldn't say such things in public. The countess overheard their conversation and was horrified when the gossip added that Annette had tried so many times to calm His Majesty's mind. But then her lover appeared next to the brunette, who also noticed the gossips, and said that it was too noisy here. The next minute, the couple watched in silence as the guards arrested the bone washers, who kept begging the chief for mercy. After this, Annette Meteor was left standing alone in the middle of the hall, listening to how everyone around her was having fun. After some time, the countess huddled up in a ball on her bed. Out of sadness, began to think that she was bored and wanted to make a friend. The emperor sat down next to her and asked how he was, to which she replied that he was always busy and did not always answer her, but she needed communication. Dietrich looked closely at his concubine and thought of a way he could solve this problem. The next day, Annette had tea in the company of two ladies, who smilingly bombarded her with questions. The lady drank tea in silence, thinking that these girlfriends had artificial smiles and soulless words. After some time, Meteor, looking at the dress, asked the seamstress if this was the latest fashion, hinting that the sleeves were very strange. The girl sheepishly told the lady that now that she had noticed it, she too thought it was too much. It later emerged that this seamstress came from a family that had made a fortune in fashion trends. The countess's eyes welled up with tears as she felt she was only making things worse. She couldn't understand who was making the people around her smile. Then she realized that everything was fine and she didn't need friends because she had Dietrich, the most handsome man in the world, a man in power who loved her. Suddenly, one day, the emperor threw a plate of food on the floor, causing it to shatter into a pile of pieces. Annette, who was sleeping on a nearby bed at the time, jumped up and asked what was happening. She saw her beloved pointing his sword at the maid. His Majesty, without removing his sword from the servant, explained that she had brought food that he did not like, and therefore he was going to punish her. But the brunette suddenly asked, stunned, who even treated their subordinates like that. Immediately after these words from his beloved, Dietrich dropped the sword on the floor, asking her for forgiveness. He hugged the girl and said that she seemed to be in a bad mood since the morning, and Annette thought that she would feel guilty if this happened again, because she wanted to be friends with that servant. The emperor asked his concubine what he could do to make her feel better, but she thought that she could not be angry with her beloved because he was her only one. The gentleman, looking at his beloved, thought that she was his little angel, and everything was clear at first glance. He understood who she was to him. The voices of ghosts followed Dietrich since childhood, when he began to participate in battles, but they all fell silent in an instant as soon as he touched the stranger with black hair and strange, seemingly out-of-this-world clothes. One day, the emperor joyfully burst into his beloved's room and said that he would arrange for her the most magnificent accession ceremony on the continent. But suddenly, the girl, trembling all over, asked if those rumors were true. His Majesty calmly asked the lady what she meant by rumors. She said excitedly that she didn't know that he was married and that he had another woman, and that the empress had died very suddenly. The concubine was surprised when the man said that she should not be concerned with these conversations, after which he asked her to choose jewelry for the ceremony. Later, when the couple went to bed, Annette could not fall asleep because she was tormented by nightmares. The spirit of the empress. A woman with snow-white hair and black eyes appeared to her and said that she would take her with her. From such a terrible dream, Meteor woke up screaming, wet with sweat and tears. Exhausted by sadness, she huddled in bed, realizing that she wanted to leave to be next to her mother again. Sometime later, the girl dared to tell her lover that she wanted to go home and wanted him to help her with this. But he suddenly asked the countess in a stern voice whether she dared to leave him, to which she fearfully replied that she had not. Dietrich asked his mistress what she was missing, since he could give her everything she wanted, then asked if she loved him at all. Annette told the king that she loved him, but she wanted to go home because she missed her mum and dad. That same day, the girl was locked in a room completely alone, without the possibility of seeing anyone except Dietrich. But some time later, the emperor burst into her room and called out to her in fear. The man saw a terrible picture. The brunette, holding a knife to her throat, asked if he loved her, then asked to let her leave if so. After this, the girl who had lost consciousness was laid on the bed with a bandaged neck. His Majesty silently watched his sleeping beloved, and the wizard who stood nearby said that he had cast a spell on her as he had ordered. He reflected that magic was still convenient. He could erase Annette's memories as much as he wanted, but the side effects could cause other memories to disappear as well unless he forgot them. The magician explained to the gentleman that if you touch some important part of a person's life, such as childhood, it can lead to madness. Dietrich thought that this was a great pity, and it meant that it would not be possible to seal the memories of her home, and Annette could not be just an empty shell. The countess woke up very quickly and, rubbing her eyes as if after a normal sleep, called out to her lover. The man asked how she slept, and she said it was strange. The emperor lied to the girl, saying she had simply fallen asleep in a chair and he had carried her to bed. The relationship started with a clean slate, was going smoothly until the empress's dog interfered. The man attacked Meteor with a sword and shouted that she was a witch. But before the attacker could do anything, Dietrich instantly covered the concubine with his body. Several guards attacked the man with a sword and detained him. Suddenly, Dietrich, deciding to turn around to look at his beloved, saw that she was lying on the ground unconscious. When the unfortunate woman was in bed, the ruler asked the magician if it seemed to him that her memory was returning, to which he replied that it was. Immediately after these words, His Majesty silently gave a sign to the guard who was standing near the door, and he began to carry out the order. One swing of the sword, and the wizard fell to the floor, a large scarlet puddle forming beneath him. Dietrich coldly ordered his servants to find him another magician who would be more competent. When the brunette recovered from her fainting spell, the emperor invited her into the gazebo, after which he served her a cup of tea, asking her to drink it. The unsuspecting girl asked if he would also drink and why he had ordered the butler to leave if she did not want to sit alone. The man sitting opposite silently watched as his beloved tried his cup of tea. But suddenly, at the same moment after Annette tried the decoction, her gaze changed from cheerful to cold and unfeeling. The lady asked her lover what she had just been doing, and he replied that she had been drinking the tea he had brought her. The emperor smiled as he thought about how the side effects of magic were more beneficial than memory magic itself. Meteor forgot everything except the important things. The man is terribly fond of the fact that his concubine can forget everything except him, her angel. Some time passed, and Cetro, sitting on the bed with an empty look, thought about why everything had been like a fog for her these past few days. But looking at the maid next to her, who was bent over a broken breakfast plate, she realized that she remembered her. The countess helped the servant to get up, telling Dietrich that he was too cruel to people because it was just breakfast. He, having decided to brew tea for the concubine, again thought that she was worried about something she couldn't even remember. The emperor, handing his mistress a cup of tea, apologized to her for disturbing her that morning and then asked her to drink the drink. But as soon as the lady took a couple of sips, it happened again. Her eyes dimmed as if she had forgotten who she was. However, the sudden voice of her lover who called out to her made the girl come to her senses. His Majesty wished the concubine good morning, and the confused Annette asked when she had already managed to get up and whether she had gotten up. Meteor took a couple of steps, but noticing the maid behind him, turned around and looked at her. She, catching the lady's gaze, broke out in sweat and trembled with fear. Suddenly, Cetro asked the servant she had been with just 2 seconds ago who she was. The maid didn't have time to respond. Continuing to shake, Dietrich asked his beloved to sit down for a moment, and she agreed. As soon as the maid managed to find herself outside the room, she still could not calm her ragged breathing. The young girl is horrified and doesn't understand how she managed to survive after this. She remembers that the head maid's words are true. Don't get attached to your masters because she is nobody to them, and never go to them unnecessarily. The maid decided that the emperor's concubine was crazy because one minute she was laughing and smiling and the next she was gloomy as death. A few days later, Annette was walking through a charming garden of red roses, but a smile was shining on her face. The young lady was made to smile by the fact that she clearly remembered the face of her new friend Eugene, although she realized that it was a little strange. The countess is tired of people treating her like a naughty girl. She wonders if that's why the blonde offered her her hand back then. Meteor realizes that while all other images are foggy, that girl's face remains clear, white hair, black cat eyes, and an oval face. Cetro likes the heroine's name. It seems familiar. She doesn't know why, but just looking at her eyes brings her a sense of calm. Eugene, enjoying the sweets, suddenly looked at the owner, who asked if she was tired of playing with the emperor's concubine. The prince told his pet that he'd stopped bothering her because he thought she liked Annette. Annette spitefully thought she wasn't playing with her but having fun. His Highness, with a smile, reminded the little girl that if she didn't like her, he would make sure she couldn't set foot in their palace. The pet remembered a conversation with Meteor where the latter said that she liked being with her and that she had few people with whom she could talk like that. The little dog thought about how she couldn't leave the countess alone because she was like a little one to her who needed to be taken care of, and she found that sweet. Finally, the blonde told the owner that everything was fine and he didn't need to interfere. He smiled and agreed with her, thinking that he had expected a completely different answer from her. He asked her to let him know if she changed her mind. The next day, Annette came to her friend's palace again, and throwing a pillow on the bench of the gazebo, invited Eugene to lie down on it. She did this, after which His Majesty's concubine asked her to relax her neck. The brunette began to massage the doggie's head, and the latter mentally noted that she was very pleased. Meteor, seeing how the little girl was enjoying her massage, laughed and said that she was doing a good job, then advised the girl to get some sleep. Annette continued to rub the child's temples quietly, humming her favorite song. The main character, hearing the countess sing, immediately remembered this melody and decided to sing it with her friend. But suddenly the girl's singing stopped. When Eugene opened her eyes in disbelief, she saw a terrifying shadow looming over her. The protagonist looked at Annette, who was surprised that she also knew this song, although it did not exist in this world. Frightened by the concubine's gloomy face, the blonde jumped up and began to deny everything, thinking that it was some kind of mistake. But the emperor's beloved, coming close to the girl's face, asked if she understood correctly that they came from the same place. Not only these words of the lady made Eugene surprised, but also the way the brunette reacted to it. The little girl saw tears streaming down Cetro's doll-like face. Without wasting a moment, the king's concubine threw herself into the arms of the dog. Through bitter sobs, and without letting go of her child, Annette said that she no longer felt alone. Eugene also hugged the countess, giving her the opportunity to fully express her emotions. When the lady finally calmed down, she asked Eugene if her real name was real, to which she replied, yes, Annette, however, said it was her old game nickname. Meteor was very surprised when it turned out that the dog came into this world on the same day as she did, only with a difference of just a few hours. She asked her friend how long she'd been here, adding that she'd been here for over 10 years. She replied that she'd only been here for a short time. The countess asked if it was possible that time flowed differently here and in the real world, as often happens in novels and Manhwa, to which Eugene said that she didn't know, but so far everything was fine. Annette smiled happily, knowing it was probably true, and 10 years here was 10 hours in Korea. She was worried her parents would look for her, but suddenly the girl asked her friend how she ended up in this world. Eugene briefly told the story of how she was walking after work at the company and was hit by a car while crossing the road without paying attention. The brunette told the blonde that it must have been very painful for her too, which she replied that fortunately she didn't remember anything, then asked what about her. The girl admitted that she had simply followed the cat. Eugene was surprised and asked if she had logged into the game. The countess asked what other game she was talking about, to which the little girl said that in this game she had a strange nickname that she did not remember. The lady said she uses the same nickname in many places. Bellabriska asked if she wasn't called Annette in the golden cage, but then Meteor asked what the golden cage was, to which the pet excitedly said that they were playing this game now. Cetro was very surprised when the dog explained that she had an accident right after she received the notification from the game and woke up there. The girl asked if there was any event in the game before she followed the cat. However, Annette looked at the child with a menacing look and asked if this meant that they had entered the game world and that she had entered through the golden cage. The girl grabbed Eugene's arms painfully and angrily asked her if there was a way to get out of here, because that's how games work. But the main character fearfully told her friend that it hurt when she held her like that. The brunette immediately pulled away and apologized. She asked if it hurt much. Then the woman said she reacted that way because she was going crazy. Bellabriska said that everything was fine, but asked why she did it. The girl said that she was simply very surprised that she found herself living in a virtual world. The countess modestly added that she was very excited, thinking there might even be a way back to the old world. She asked Eugene to tell her more about this game. The protagonist explained that the dragon feather is an item that can be used to exit the game, but the dragon is not fire-breathing but a divine being. Feng Huang, born at the end of the world, realized his mission as a messenger of God the moment he opened his eyes. Dragon feathers are traces left in the cradle by a bird that has embarked on the divine path. They are said to contain a portion of the power capable of opening a passage. Annette immediately suggested finding out what kind of bird it was bringing a feather and returning back, but she said with a smile that she would like to believe that everything was that simple. But the countess happily declared that she believed that the item in the game would help them because she herself said that the prince and princess were characters in the game. Bellabriska was hurt by Cetro's words. She wanted to tell her that she saw Michael and Raphaela as people, not characters, but she remained silent. The concubine enthusiastically decided that she had to find this feather, and to do so she would collect all the feathers in the country to test this theory. The girl asked Eugene not to worry as she would ask her to bring 2 feathers for them, but she suddenly waved her hands and said that she didn't have to. Anna was very surprised by this and said she would never do such a thing. She gloomily asked the girl if she didn't want to go back. This question made the protagonist fall silent, her eyes widening in surprise. Some time had passed since those events, but in the prince's castle everything went on unchanged. Eugene, arriving at the owner's office, sank into her knees, saddened by the fact that everything around her was a game. She simply used the event to place herself in the place of the original game character. The little girl is not used to hearing that the prince and princess are just characters. But suddenly the prince sat down next to the girl and, stroking her head, asked what had happened. Because of the doggy's bad mood, she felt uncomfortable being touched, so she abruptly pulled her owner's hand away. The heroine's bold reaction surprised the prince so much that he raised his eyebrows and his hand froze in the air. Eugene remembers that on the first day she lay like this in front of the prince because she knew everything about the game, but now she was tired of reality and stopped thinking. The young lady simply accepted this blind love that was connected with her master. The girl carefully took the man's hand, which she had just recently pulled away, and pulled it towards herself. Blushing in embarrassment, the dog placed Michael's large hand on the top of her head, thinking about how he was her favorite character in the game. The prince stroked the girl's head with a smile, and she thought that she simply wanted to live like a favorite toy. But for some reason she felt tamed. The fox in The Little Prince is said to have been tamed and remained happy, but the little prince left. Remembering this, the main character called out to the owner in fear and grabbed his chest. The girl hugged him, and from this, His Highness's ears and neck turned sweetly red. Bellabriska told the man that he couldn't leave her after he tamed her. Without letting go of her owner's embrace, she added that she didn't think she would be happy if he were no longer around. Meanwhile, Annette boldly walks straight to the Emperor's office where she is noticed by 2 guards. One of the guards told the girl that she should not enter and that he would tell her that she had come. But the countess suddenly ordered him to leave. As soon as the lady burst into the room, everyone present, including Dietrich, immediately turned their gaze to her. The man greeted his angel, and the girl, coming closer to him, said that she had one very cherished wish. Medallion noticed the nobles standing behind her and thought that she didn't care how they reacted, because no matter what she did, the king would still call her his. The girl does not understand why it is her fault that she cannot stop the emperor's extravagant behavior, so she sits on his lap. Putting her arm around the man's shoulders, she said that all she wanted was the feathers of the most valuable bird in the world, known as the dragon feather. The brunette thought that when there was no one by her side, she thought that she only had these strong arms and that she had to save her beloved. Dietrich told his beloved with a smile that the most precious feather in the world must be with his treasure, so he would get it. The girl took the emperor by the cheeks and reached for his lips, thinking that her appearance here was just an accident, and she was not an angel sent for Dietrich. Annette kissed the man passionately, realizing in her mind that she desperately wanted to go home. Sometime later, Dietrich, alone in his office, thought about how much he liked his concubine, with whom he flirted and gave her gifts. He also likes the fact that she doesn't delve into her memory and now rarely remembers her home. There is only one problem. The ruler knows that his son has been communicating with a slave in recent days, but he cannot remember this, which irritates him. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, after which a guest entered the gentleman's room. The magician bowed and asked His Majesty why he had summoned him, and he asked him what had happened to the medicine he had spoken of. The wizard explained that forgetfulness was also a side effect, but the emperor asked sternly if his role wasn't to make that possible. The mage tried to say that it was a subtle interweaving of magic, but Dietrich, irritably hitting the arm of the chair, called the man useless, because he would not use such an excuse for an order. But then the sorcerer said that if Annette really was a deity, then perhaps this had nothing to do with magic. The king asked him to clarify what he was talking about. He added that if this is the memory of a person from the pantheon, then this is a matter of the soul, and is the field of theology. His Majesty narrowed his eyes in disgust, thinking that theology was in fact superstition. It's a bit of an outrage for Dietrich, but since he can't call on any of the empire's priests, he'll have to wait for the mages to sort this out. The gentleman asked the wizard to stop talking nonsense and do something useful. The sorcerer bowed his head low before the emperor and said that he obeyed him. Eugene sits on the bed, angrily tapping her heel. One detail is deeply troubling the girl. Lately, it had been difficult for her to see the prince, but she still could not calm down and wandered back and forth with thoughts of whether everything was okay with him. But then the little girl decided to get up on her feet because she could no longer sit idle. She tried to stay away from him because he was busy with work, but today she decided to look into his office, so she opened the door in peace. However, looking around, the young lady realized that it was quiet around and no one was visible. But suddenly she noticed the owner had fallen asleep right at the table. His emotionless face resembled a doll's. Eugene was very touched by the fact that Michael fell asleep while working, but then she thought about how tired he was. The girl began to look around, arguing that if she touched him, he would wake up and continue working again, so she wanted to cover him with a blanket. Very quickly, the little one went nearby to the blanket, which, by the way, was a tablecloth, but she didn't care. The main character decided to put the sweet snacks in a convenient place, after which she carried the blanket to Michael. The protagonist not only covered the gentleman with a blanket, but also tied its corners into a knot so that it would not come undone, but the prince's head began to fall down. Eugene, seeing this, jumped back from the sleeping man in fear, thinking that because of her he was about to wake up. But thanks to the girl's quick reaction, she managed to save her owner by holding his head with both hands. When the main character felt that the owner's head was holding on, she carefully removed her hands. The little girl looked with pity into the face of her sleeping owner, remembering that he was usually awake when she came to him. Leaving the man to rest, the dog quietly left the room and closed the door behind her. A short time later, Michael woke up. His first thought was that he had fallen asleep so quietly because he hadn't slept for several days. But as soon as he noticed that someone had wrapped him in a tablecloth and laid out sweets in front of him, he smiled because he immediately realized that this was the work of Eugene. Remembering her bright smile, the man thought that she was always so awkward when she left and when she came. With his spirits lifted, the prince decided to continue the work, which he needed to complete as soon as possible. The next day, Michael went to see his pet accompanied by 2 of her guards. Hartin told His Highness that Eugene had been reading a book and had fallen asleep. The Lord told the guards they could go. The man lifted the sleeping baby into his arms, thinking to himself how light she was. The gentleman put the girl to bed and covered her with a blanket, thinking that she needed to grow up. Then the prince thought that the room was too light, so he quickly closed the curtains. The room became dimly lit, and Michael, sitting down next to his pet to admire her, mentally wished the little one's sweet dreams. But then the little dog opened its eyes, looked at its owner, and called out to him. He stroked the girl's forehead with his large palm, advising her to sleep a little longer. As soon as the man removed his hand, he saw that the blonde obeyed him and fell asleep again. Michael thought that he was surprised that he had never felt so good about taking care of someone. However, the young gentleman realized that the thought of anyone other than his girl made him want to strangle the person in disgust. Michael realizes that Eugene, a silly, charming girl, is special to him. The first thing he gave her was love, and she will be his forever. The prince gently kissed the baby on the forehead, thinking that she belonged only to him and only she knew that he could be so sweet with her. Feeling this, the main character smiled and her cheeks blushed like peaches. Then the gentleman took Eugene's little hand and kissed it, promising himself that he would take care of his girl forever. The next day, Eugene and Annette came to the library at the Imperial Palace. The countess told the little girl that Dietrich had promised to find the feathers so they would hear from him soon. But the heroine wondered why she needed to go to the Emperor's library when she had Michael's library. The brunette asked her friend to look at a book, whose story was very similar to the one she had told her. Suddenly Lady Cetro's gaze dimmed and her lips froze in the same smile. The girl asked in confusion what it was, and a puzzled Eugene called out to her friend. Annette apologized for being forgetful lately, and it was probably because she no longer had to use her brain like she did in school. The protagonist looked at the countess, not understanding anything, who said that she had better go back before she made a complete fool of herself here. Medallion grabbed her head and admitted that she had no idea how, but her memory had deteriorated significantly, although it seemed like nothing had changed. She suggested that it might be because her hair had not grown an inch in 10 years and it probably couldn't be fixed. The girl asked her in fear what she was talking about, thinking that she, the short one, would remain here like this forever. Annette began to resent the fact that people called her vile and creepy behind her back, and after that incident at the lake, everyone blamed her as if it was she who ordered the digging. The countess seemed to have been replaced. She furiously declared that everyone was hanging all sorts of rumors on her, which she hated. She hated this world and everything that is in it. When the girl finished venting her anger, Eugene touched her and told her that everything was okay, and that she understood that this was hard for her. But the pet asked if there were things she liked, and the brunette asked what she meant. The heroine sheepishly recalled that she had said that she liked the emperor, but suddenly Annette, smiling maliciously sarcastically, replied that she really liked Dietrich. Eugene was very surprised by the lady's words and intonation, because it turned out that she had no feelings for the emperor. Sitting on the edge of the table, Medea shared with the blonde that the whole world hated and rejected her, but only one person liked her. Looking at the girl with emotionless eyes, she asked if she had ever had the opportunity to love someone else. The protagonist thought that the same could be said about her and Michael. The whole world might hate Eugene, but he loved her. The girl thought that nothing else mattered and took her master's outstretched hand. While she lived in the old world, she hated everything in the world and wanted nothing, and the prince was the only joy she had. But Annette told the girl that Dietrich was the only one she had. But in her case, this did not bring her any happiness at all. The countess burst into tears. She said that in her past life she had friends and many more people who liked her, and she had a mother and father who accepted her without knowing any Dietrich. Medallion burst into tears, only adding that she hated this world and wanted to return to her parents. Doggy hugged her and told her everything was fine. The heroine looked thoughtfully at the lady, who said that she couldn't wait to return, and asked if she would succeed at all. The protagonist said that she would of course succeed, and there was no need to talk nonsense, but she wondered if she would leave this world with her. When the brunette finally calmed down, she thanked the little girl for her support and said that she was already feeling better. She said that this was good, but she thought about the fact that Annette had no one to rely on here, and she as an adult had no choice but to take care of her. As soon as Eugene looked at her watch, she screamed in horror that it was too late and she had to go. The disappointed countess asked if she was in such a hurry to get home, and she replied that she was. The pet turned to her friend and wanted to say that her owner was already waiting for her, but she came to her senses and simply said that it was time for her to go to Michael. This upset Cetro, so she didn't answer the little girl, but only looked away and pursed her lip. Following the blonde, Annette decided to ask if she thought Prince Michael looked like Dietrich in his youth. The girl asked if she really thought so, and she added that the older he gets, the more he looks like his father, a different hair color, but the same eyes. The emperor's concubine said with a smile that Michael was like a mini Dietrich, but Eugene, hurrying toward her native palace, objected that this wasn't true and Michael was. Michael Meteor, frightened, said that wasn't what she meant. There was silence between the girls, and the brunette apologized to the dog, saying that she didn't mean to offend her. The girl decided to ask her friend if she felt sympathy for the prince, saying that because of this, she seemed not to want to return home. Eugene turned to Annette and said that if she had a family, she missed she didn't have one and couldn't go back to them. The concubine asked the little girl for forgiveness, but she waved her hands and said everything was fine because a lot of time had already passed. But the main character thought that she really thinks that everything is okay now. Several hours flew by quickly, and the sun's rays painted the prince's palace red. The main character was walking down the corridor, accompanied by guards, but suddenly they stopped because they met Michael on their way. The man looked at his pet and smiled at her, then asked if she was returning from her walk. Eugene, looking at the gentleman, thought that it was all because of him. When she thinks about her mom and dad, she feels more joy than loneliness. The young lady does not understand why she wants to run up to her master and hug him, because if her heart starts beating faster, everything will be very bad. The little girl calmly walked towards the prince, who didn't understand anything, turning her head in different directions, ordering herself to calm down and be careful. The next day, the dog, having breakfast in the company of Michael, sadly picks at the pie with a fork, not wanting to eat it. The man asked her if she liked the food and if she wanted anything else, to which she sheepishly replied that she was simply not hungry. He then asked her if she liked the taste, thinking that he would eliminate their pastry chef and steal the one who works in the princess's palace, since Eugene liked his desserts better. But the lady said that everything was fine. The girl wanted to say that everything tasted fine, but she didn't have time because the owner put a spoon with a piece of cake in her mouth. His Highness and the girl froze in such a position that the latter thought that she did not want to eat now. But if Michael was feeding her, then she had no choice. Moreover, the prince stares at her without taking his eyes off her. The heroine doesn't understand his intentions. Why does he continue to feed her delicious food? Just then, when the man took the spoon away from the baby, he saw a small piece of cream left on her lip. He reached out with his fingers to remove it. However, the protagonist did not allow him to do this, sharply moving back. And enraged, Michael began to wonder why his girl was in a bad mood and whether one of the courtiers, the escort, or the aristocrats was to blame. Suddenly, at that very moment, the butler burst into the prince's room, wanting to tell him good news. But he was overcome with fear when he saw Michael, who was shooting him an angry look and saying that he was still in a good mood. But the master's anger vanished when the servant informed him that the route he had planned was completed. His Highness stood up and walked over to the bewildered Eugene to remove a piece of cream from her lips. Then he licked the cream off his finger and asked the little girl if she liked water. The main character's face turned red in a split second from sheer embarrassment. She couldn't utter a word, only wondering what it was about Michael. The next day, Eugene, running along the corridor, which is filled with suitcases with her things, does not understand why all her things are being packed somewhere. The girl looked out into the street and saw a prepared carriage there, with servants also bustling around it, packing luggage. The little dog grabbed her head in horror as it seemed she was being kicked out of the palace.